Go ahead and get comfortable. Settle in. Let your shoulders drop. Close your eyes if you want to. We're going to spend some time tonight wandering through a town you probably already know. A town with a nuclear power plant on the hill, a family on Evergreen Terrace, a quickie mart on the corner, and more unresolved mysteries buried underneath its streets than anyone has ever properly counted. Springfield. Population unknown. Location unknown. Time period also, somehow, unknown. And that's where we're going to begin. Not with a list, not with a countdown, but with a slow walk through the evidence. The kind of walk you take when the night is quiet and there's no particular hurry and you're just letting the details wash over you one at a time. The Simpsons has been on the air since the 17th of December, 1989, 36 seasons, nearly 800 episodes. The longest-running animated series in American history, the longest-running scripted primetime show ever produced, the longest-running sitcom on television by a significant margin. These are facts so often repeated that they've lost most of their weight, but sit with them for a moment. 36 years. That's longer than most of the people watching have been alive. That's longer than the internet has been a household concept. That's longer than cell phones, streaming services, social media, and about 4 or 5 complete cultural reinventions of what American life is supposed to look like. And through all of that, through every shift in technology and politics and culture and humor, one thing has stayed exactly the same. The family on Evergreen Terrace hasn't aged a single day. But we'll come back to that. Tonight we're going to move slowly through the biggest, strangest, most carefully hidden plot holes and theories in the history of this show. We're going to look at things the series has been quietly telling us for decades without ever saying them directly. And we're going to let the details accumulate the way they do in the background of the show itself, quietly, patiently, building towards something that changes the way the whole picture looks. So get comfortable. Let your breathing slow down. There's no rush here. Let's start with the thing that sits in the background of almost every single episode and that almost nobody ever stops to really examine. The Springfield nuclear power plant. Not as a gag, not as a piece of set dressing, as the central fact of Springfield's existence. The plant is a 2-unit pressurized water reactor facility. It generates electricity for the entire town. It employs a significant portion of Springfield's working population. It dominates the skyline. It sits at the physical and economic center of life in this community, and it is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most dangerous industrial facilities ever depicted in the history of fictional storytelling. When a surprise safety inspection was conducted at the plant, inspectors found 342 violations. Let that number settle for a moment. 342. The kinds of violations that were found weren't minor paperwork issues or bureaucratic technicalities. They were violations involving radioactive waste being discharged directly into bodies of water, radioactive material being deposited on children's playgrounds, plutonium bars being used as paperweights on office desks, cooling towers with structural cracks that had been patched with chewing gum, not repaired, patched with gum, luminous rats living in the facility's lower levels, glowing with radiation bright enough to be visible in the dark, and then, buried in the basement of an active nuclear reactor, a detail the show drops so casually it's almost easy to miss entirely. Human skeletons. The show doesn't explain who those people were. It doesn't explain how they got there. It doesn't explain what happened to them or how long they'd been in the basement of a working reactor facility. It just shows you the bones and moves on, and nobody in Springfield asks a single question about it. Now, at this point, you might expect the story to involve some kind of oversight mechanism, some layer of protection between the plant's catastrophic condition and the people living downwind of it. There is one, technically. The position exists. The role of nuclear safety inspector for the facility is filled by a man named Homer Simpson. Homer Simpson, whose IQ has been established canonically by the show's own creator as 55. Homer Simpson, in whom a crayon was discovered lodged deep in the brain cavity from childhood, physically reducing his cognitive function in measurable ways. Homer Simpson, who has been documented sleeping at his safety workstation, who has set off nuclear incidents through acts of impulsive carelessness, who once threw a donut into an active reactor core to observe whether it would grow larger. That is the man standing between Springfield and radioactive catastrophe. He has been standing there, in that specific capacity, failing at that specific job for the better part of 4 decades. And the plant's owner, Charles Montgomery Burns, knows exactly who Homer Simpson is. He knows what Homer's presence in that role means for the facility's regulatory status. He knows because when German investors briefly purchased the plant from Burns during a period of financial difficulty, the very first thing they did upon taking ownership was fire Homer. They looked at the staff, assessed the situation, and removed the safety inspector on day one. The second thing they did was commission an estimate for bringing the plant up to code. The estimate was so enormous it very nearly bankrupted the new ownership group. Burns bought the plant back. He rehired Homer immediately. This is not an accident. This is not Burns being careless or forgetful or sentimental about an employee he's known for years. A competent safety inspector would shut that plant down within a week of taking the job seriously. Homer ensures that never happens. Homer's incompetence is the facility's best protection against regulatory scrutiny. As long as Homer is in Sector 7G pressing the wrong buttons and sleeping through alarms, the violations continue unreported. The waste continues to flow where it flows, and Burns' monopoly over Springfield's power supply remains intact. Now, here's where the theory that runs underneath everything else begins to take shape. What is that waste actually doing to the people of Springfield? The first visible answer appeared in Season 2. A fish was caught in the river near the power plant. It had 3 eyes. Its name, given to it by the press and the public, was Blinky, and Blinky became briefly national news within the show's universe. A gubernatorial candidate used the 3-eyed fish as evidence that Burns' facility was actively poisoning the environment. Burns was compelled to eat the fish on live television to demonstrate it was harmless. The town watched. The town shrugged. The campaign moved on. Nobody tested the water. Nobody conducted follow-up studies. Nobody asked the question that should have been the first question out of anyone's mouth. If the fish in this river have developed an additional eye from environmental contamination, what exactly is happening to the people who have been drinking from the same river their entire lives? The answer has been sitting in the show's own mythology since Season 8. In the episode commonly known as the Springfield Files, Homer encounters something in the woods near town while walking home late at night. What he describes is a strange glowing figure, humanoid but wrong somehow, moving with an unsteady, euphoric quality, as though not quite in possession of its full faculties. The figure emits visible light, a green glow, soft and constant, emanating from the body itself. Springfield panics. FBI agents are called in. The investigation consumes the town. And when the truth finally emerges, the glowing figure in the woods is not an alien. It is Mr. Burns. Burns has been undergoing a weekly medical treatment so intensive, so saturated with chemicals and radiation therapy, that the process temporarily causes his body to emit a visible green glow. The treatment is not optional. Without it, Burns dies within the week. He requires this intervention every 7 days, and the physical after effects of each session leave him wandering the woods in a dazed and euphoric state, stumbling through the trees like a creature from another world. He glows in the dark. Not metaphorically, not as an animation choice. Within the logic of the show's own universe, Charles Montgomery Burns is so saturated with radiation that his body produces visible light. And Springfield looked at this glowing figure and concluded it must be an extraterrestrial visitor. Not the power plant, not the radiation, a being from outer space. The denial runs that deep. Now consider the Simpsons movie, the film that brought the animated world of Springfield to theatrical screens in 2007. By the time of the movie's events, Springfield's environmental contamination has reached a point so severe, so irreversible, that the Environmental Protection Agency, a real federal agency operating within the film's narrative, concludes that the only viable solution is physical containment. A massive glass dome is constructed and lowered over the entire town, sealing it off from the surrounding environment to prevent Springfield's pollution from spreading further across the country. Think about what that means. The United States government looked at Springfield and determined that the contamination was so total, so pervasive, so far beyond remediation, that the correct course of action was to seal the town like a specimen in a jar. Springfield isn't just a polluted community at that point. Springfield has been classified as an environmental hazard severe enough to require isolation, and every resident, every single person who has spent years drinking the water and breathing the air and living in the shadow of those cracked cooling towers, they're still inside when the dome goes down. Now look at those residents. Look at them carefully. Homer Simpson, massive overbite. Eyes that appear to occupy a disproportionate amount of the face, bulging slightly outward in a way that doesn't occur in standard human anatomy. 4 fingers on each hand, not 5. A skull shape that a physician would likely find deeply concerning. A body that absorbs physical punishment that would kill an ordinary person many times over. He has survived gunshots, electrical shocks, falls from significant heights, direct vehicle strikes, and explosions. His healing rate is superhuman. His pain tolerance is extraordinary. His cognitive function is severely impaired. Marge Simpson, the same prominent eyes, the same 4-fingered hands, and the famous hair, the tower of blue that has maintained its exact shape for 36 years with no apparent product or structural support, growing straight up from her head in defiance of what gravity is supposed to do to human hair. Marge worked at the nuclear facility herself at one point. She was exposed to the plant's environment, the same violations, the same leaking systems, and her children were conceived and born after both she and Homer had already spent years absorbing Springfield's contaminated atmosphere. The children, all 3 of them, born in Springfield, raised in Springfield, drinking the same water, breathing the same air, living under the same cooling towers. All of them display physical characteristics that don't occur in ordinary human populations. The spiky hair that holds its shape without product, the overbites, the wide, prominent eyes, the yellow skin, and that's the detail that makes everything else click. The yellow skin, when characters visit Springfield from outside, when guest stars and one-time characters arrive from the world beyond the town's limits, they look different. Noticeably, fundamentally different. Their proportions are more natural, their features more closely approximate what human beings actually look like. The show's standard response to this observation is that the guests are drawn with more realistic proportions as a visual storytelling device to distinguish outsiders from established characters. But inside the logic of the show's own universe, there is a visible, observable, consistent difference between people who live in Springfield and people who don't. The people inside the contamination zone look mutated. The people outside it look normal. Even the animals are affected. The Simpson family dog, Santa's Little Helper, has the same wide eyes and unusual proportions as his owners. Blinky the 3-eyed fish is the most famous example, but he is not the only mutated creature in Springfield's ecosystem. The wildlife of the town shows the same patterns as its human population. The show tells you directly, with Blinky, what the radiation is doing to living organisms in this environment. And then it expects you to believe that those same organisms, when they happen to be human and happen to be the main characters, are completely unaffected. Burns has always known. The show makes this explicit in multiple episodes across multiple seasons. Burns funds private medical research through his personal fortune. He retains personal physicians. He undergoes those weekly treatments that keep him alive through what amounts to chronic radiation poisoning managed by aggressive medical intervention. Burns understands radiation not as an abstract industrial concern but as a personal biological reality, because radiation is the mechanism keeping him alive. He knows what prolonged exposure does to the body. He knows what his facility has been doing to Springfield's water supply and air quality and food chain for decades. He knows because his own body is a case study in radiation exposure, and he has the resources to manage what the residents of Springfield, with their limited access to medical care, cannot manage at all. And here's the piece that connects it all into something coherent and genuinely unsettling. Springfield's population is cognitively impaired. Not uniformly, not identically, but consistently. The town makes decisions that serve Burns's interests at every turn, even when those decisions are against their own. They watch a fish get pulled from the river with 3 eyes, and they let the story fade within a news cycle. They see their employer glowing in the dark, and they conclude it must be a visitor from another planet. They vote for politicians who campaign on behalf of the nuclear plant's interests. They accept an economic structure where their livelihoods, their electricity, their community's entire financial foundation is entirely controlled by a single billionaire who cannot even be bothered to remember the name of the man who runs his safety department. The town that should be most alarmed by the power plant is the town most dependent on it. And the population most affected by the plant's contamination is the population least equipped to recognize what's happening to them. That's not an accident of storytelling. That's a feedback loop that the show has been depicting accurately and in detail for 36 consecutive years. In Season 12, the show revealed something about Homer that reframes his entire character. In an episode that treated the premise seriously rather than as a throwaway gag, doctors discovered that the crayon lodged in Homer's brain since childhood was responsible for a significant suppression of his cognitive function. When the crayon was removed surgically, Homer's IQ rose dramatically. He became articulate. He became perceptive. He became capable of understanding his life and his environment with a clarity he had never previously experienced. And it made him miserable. With his intelligence restored, Homer could see Springfield for what it actually was. He could see his job for what it actually was. He could see the patterns and the structures and the relationships that his radiation-dimmed mind had always been too foggy to trace. He saw clearly, possibly for the first time as an adult, and the clarity was unbearable. So he had the crayon put back. He chose to return to the fog. Now, here's the question the episode raises and then quietly sidesteps. How did a crayon get into a child's brain in the first place without anyone noticing? How did Homer go through his entire childhood, his adolescence, his adult life, visiting doctors in Springfield, receiving medical care from Springfield's healthcare infrastructure, and not a single physician discovered a foreign object lodged in his skull? Either Springfield's medical establishment is so comprehensively incompetent that it cannot detect an object in a patient's brain during routine examination, or the medical establishment in Springfield is not entirely independent of the interests of the town's dominant employer, and someone, somewhere in that infrastructure, knew the crayon was there and made a decision not to remove it. If Burns's influence extends into Springfield's healthcare system, then Homer's cognitive impairment is not simply the result of a childhood accident. It's a condition that was allowed to persist, possibly a condition that was managed, possibly a condition that serves the same function that Homer's employment as safety inspector serves, keeping the most potentially disruptive mind in the plant's most critical oversight position safely below the level of perception needed to understand what's actually happening. The radiation theory doesn't solve one mystery about the Simpsons. It solves all of them simultaneously. The characters don't age because their biology has been fundamentally altered at the cellular level by decades of radiation exposure. The town resets after catastrophes because the population's memory and critical thinking functions are chronically compromised. Homer survives injuries that should kill him because his body has adapted to an irradiated environment in ways that make him nearly indestructible while devastating him cognitively. Burns stays alive through interventions that would destroy a normal person because he has spent a century developing the medical infrastructure to manage his own exposure. And nobody in Springfield questions any of it because the same contamination that mutated their bodies also damaged the neural architecture responsible for asking why. Springfield isn't a quirky cartoon town where slightly unusual things happen for comedic purposes. Springfield is a contamination zone that has been poisoning its residents for decades, and the residents cannot see it because the contamination has already done its primary work. Every yellow face is a symptom. Every four-fingered hand is a symptom. Every impossible recovery, every forgotten catastrophe, every unexplained mutation in the water and the wildlife and the people, it all traces back to those cracked cooling towers and the invisible substance leaking from them into the ground and the water and the air. The nuclear power plant isn't part of the backdrop of The Simpsons. It is the show's central fact. Everything else, every character, every storyline, every joke, exists in relationship to what the plant has done and is doing to the town beneath it. And the plant was designed that way. Not by the writers, but within the logic of the show's universe, by Burns. He built a facility that would serve as Springfield's sole power source, creating complete economic dependency. He staffed its most critical safety position with a man incapable of performing its functions. He maintained the violations that keep the contamination flowing. And he did all of this while personally benefiting from the most advanced radiation management medicine that his enormous fortune could purchase, ensuring that he alone among Springfield's residents would survive long enough to watch the results of what he built. Burns doesn't live in Springfield proper, not really. He lives above it, separated from it by wealth and gates and personal physicians and a weekly treatment that keeps his diseases in a state of managed equilibrium. He observes Springfield the way a researcher observes a long-running experiment. Because that's what Springfield is. His experiment, his proof of concept, his evidence that a population, given enough time and enough contamination and enough economic dependency, will stop asking questions about the water their fish grow extra eyes in. That's the foundation. That's the ground beneath every other mystery we're going to explore tonight. Get comfortable. Close your eyes. Let the weight of the day settle away from your shoulders. We're just getting started. Before we move on, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always interesting to see how many people from different parts of the world are falling asleep to the same story at the same moment. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's a good time. We'll be here when you wake up. Still with me? Good. Let the room be quiet and warm. Let your breathing slow. We're going to go deeper now into something that's been sitting right on the surface of The Simpsons since the very first episode. Something so visible and so constant that it becomes invisible through sheer familiarity. The physical appearance of the people of Springfield. Everyone in Springfield is yellow. Not pale, not tan, not some variation of the range of human skin tones that exists in the real world. Yellow. A specific, uniform, undeniable yellow that covers every resident of the town regardless of their background, their ancestry, their age, or anything else about them. It's one of the most recognizable visual signatures in the history of television, and most people accept it without a second thought because they've been looking at it for so long that it has simply become what people look like in this fictional world. But it's worth asking, gently and without any particular urgency, why? The official story, the one Matt Groening has told in interviews over the years, is that the yellow skin is a design choice intended to grab viewers' attention while flipping through channels. In the early days of the show's development, when cable television was a landscape of channel surfing and split-second decisions about what to watch, a program populated by characters with bright yellow skin would stand out visually in a way that standard animation palettes wouldn't. The yellow was a marketing decision, a branding choice, a way to make the show instantly recognizable from across a room. That's true, that was the intent, and it worked. The Simpsons yellow is one of the most distinctive visual choices in the history of animated television. But here's what the show has done with that choice over 36 years, perhaps unintentionally, perhaps not. It has built an entire fictional universe in which the residents of one specific town have a skin condition that does not appear in any healthy human population anywhere in the world, and it has never, not once, provided an in-universe explanation for why this is. The yellow skin is not explained by cartoon convention within the logic of the show itself. It's not treated as normal in the way that, say, the Flintstones world is simply accepted as a world where cartoon people live alongside dinosaurs. The Simpsons is set in a version of contemporary America where normal-looking human beings exist. They just don't live in Springfield. Think about the outsiders. The characters who visit Springfield from elsewhere in the show's universe. They look different. Not cartoon different, not stylistically simplified. They look like more anatomically plausible human beings. Their skin tones fall within the range of actual human variation. Their proportions are less exaggerated. Their features are less distinctive. They look like the kind of people you might pass on the street in any American city. And the moment they cross into Springfield's narrative geography, there's a visual line between them and the town's established residents. This creates a visual grammar within the show that the production team has never officially acknowledged, but that becomes impossible to ignore once you've noticed it. Springfield's people look one way. Everyone else looks another way. And the difference between the two groups maps almost exactly onto the question of proximity to the nuclear facility. The yellow skin has been present from the beginning. It appears in every member of the Simpson family. It appears in Ned Flanders next door. It appears in Moe behind his bar. It appears in Apu at the Quickie Mart. It appears in Chief Wiggum. It appears in Principal Skinner. It appears in Dr. Hibbert, who is a physician and who has presumably never noticed anything unusual about the fact that his patients all share a skin condition that shouldn't exist. Dr. Hibbert is worth a moment of attention here. He is Springfield's most prominent medical professional. He has treated essentially every main character on the show at one point or another. He has access to the full health histories of the Simpson family and presumably the wider community. He is depicted as a competent, even gifted physician in many respects. And in all the years he has been treating patients in Springfield, he has apparently never looked at the collective skin color of his patient population and found it worthy of investigation. Either Dr. Hibbert is not the physician he appears to be, or he knows something about the cause of this condition and has chosen, for reasons we can only speculate about, not to raise it with his patients. The second possibility becomes more interesting when you consider the influence Burns exercises over Springfield's professional class. The doctor, the lawyer, the mayor, the chief of police, each of them exists within an economic ecosystem that Burns controls. Each of them has reasons, financial and otherwise, to maintain a relationship with the town's dominant employer. Asking uncomfortable questions about a skin condition affecting the entire town's population could lead very quickly to other uncomfortable questions about the water supply, the air quality, and the three-eyed fish in the river. Nobody seems inclined to go there. Now, the 4 fingers. Every character in the show has 4 fingers on each hand. 8 fingers total, no thumbs counted separately. Again, this is explained as an animation shortcut. Drawing 4 fingers is faster than drawing 5. It was standard practice in early animation, and The Simpsons simply maintained the tradition. Artistically, this is a perfectly reasonable explanation. But within the show's universe, 4 fingers is not an animation shortcut. It's a physical characteristic shared by every Springfield resident, and 4-fingered humans do not exist in the real world. Polydactyly, the condition of having extra fingers, occurs very rarely. Its opposite, ectrodactyly, the absence of certain digits, also occurs very rarely and does not produce the uniform pattern of 4-fingered hands seen across Springfield's entire population. What the show depicts is an entire community where everyone has the same number of digits on each hand, uniformly, without any of them or their doctors apparently finding this remarkable. Outside the show, when characters from the wider world of the show's universe appear, they have, well, the show still draws them with 4 fingers, because it would look jarring to suddenly introduce 5-fingered hands as a visual indicator of outsider status. But conceptually, within the show's logic, if Springfield residents are the mutated ones, if they are the population that has been altered by environmental contamination, then the 4-finger hands are a mutation. They're not a stylistic choice within the show's reality. They're a biological deviation from the human norm that every Springfield resident shares and that nobody has ever commented on. The hands and the skin together. That's already a significant accumulation of shared physical abnormality for a single community. Add the eyes, the wide, prominent, slightly bulging eyes that appear on virtually every Springfield resident. The eyes that don't quite match the proportions you'd expect in a typical human face. Add the hair, which in multiple characters defies physics and grows in directions that hair simply doesn't grow. Marge's vertical tower, Bart's immutable spikes, Lisa's perfectly geometric star points. These are not just cartoon styling choices within the show's world. They're physical realities that the characters live with, that their environment accepts, that nobody examines. The mutation hypothesis, the idea that the power plant's contamination has gradually altered the biology of Springfield's residents over decades, would explain all of this. Radiation doesn't produce predictable, orderly mutations. It doesn't create changes that follow a neat pattern. But it does create changes that accumulate over generations, that manifest differently in different individuals, that produce a range of effects in a population exposed to the same source. What Springfield shows us is not a single dramatic mutation affecting one person. It's a distribution of unusual physical traits scattered across an entire community, all of whom share a common exposure source. The wildlife supports this reading. The three-eyed fish is the most famous example. Blinky became a symbol, a piece of evidence that critics of the plant used to argue for its shutdown, and then Blinky became a punchline when Burns ate him on television and nobody died immediately. But the fish in Springfield's waterways didn't stop being mutated because the news cycle moved on. They kept existing in their mutated state, swimming through water that the entire town was also drawing from. And here's a detail that the show introduces and then never develops the way it probably should. The show has, in various episodes, depicted other unusual wildlife in and around Springfield. Animals with unexpected colorations. Creatures behaving in ways that strain credulity even for animated comedy. The environment of Springfield is not simply the backdrop for human stories. It's an active participant in those stories, slowly and quietly doing things to the organisms that live within it. Santa's little helper, the Simpson family dog, has those wide, slightly exaggerated eyes. He has the same deviation from standard dog anatomy that his owners have from standard human anatomy. He drinks the same water. He breathes the same air. He has lived his entire life within the contamination zone. And he looks like a Springfield resident because he is one. Now, here's where the mutation theory intersects with something the show has done deliberately and thoughtfully across many episodes, which is to use the physical characteristics of Springfield's residents as emotional shorthand for their inner lives. Homer's bulk, his enormous appetite, his seemingly unlimited capacity for absorbing physical punishment, these could be adaptations. A body that has been irradiated and mutated over a lifetime might develop compensatory mechanisms, a dramatically elevated metabolism that processes damage more efficiently than a normal body could, a pain response that's been altered by neural damage to register less acutely than it would in an uncontaminated person. Homer doesn't feel pain the way you're supposed to feel pain. He survives things you're not supposed to survive. And the show treats this as comedy without ever explaining it. But if his body has adapted to an irradiated environment, if his cellular repair mechanisms have been upregulated by decades of low-level radiation exposure, in the same way that some organisms develop radiation resistance through successive generations of exposure, then Homer's physical resilience isn't a cartoon convenience, it's a mutation. A useful one, from a survival perspective, even if it came packaged with the cognitive impairment. Lisa's story is a different branch of the same tree. She is demonstrably the most cognitively gifted member of the Simpson family and one of the most intellectually capable people in Springfield. Her IQ has been measured at a level that qualifies her for testing programs designed for exceptional minds. She plays the saxophone with genuine skill and emotional depth. She thinks clearly about systems and patterns in a way that most Springfield residents simply cannot. She is, in almost every measurable sense, an outlier in her community. What if that's also a mutation? What if whatever the radiation did to Homer's brain, dimming and impairing its function, did something different to Lisa? What if some variations in the contamination's effects produce cognitive enhancement rather than cognitive reduction? The same environmental cause, the same exposure, the same Springfield water and air, producing opposite effects in different individuals depending on factors that are difficult to predict in advance of their manifestation? Homer got cognitively impaired, Lisa got cognitively amplified. Bart landed somewhere in between, smart enough to execute elaborate plans but without the sustained focus or academic discipline to direct that intelligence toward conventional success. Maggie, as we'll discuss in much greater detail later, appears to have gotten something else entirely. The mutation theory doesn't require that the radiation affects everyone the same way. It doesn't require a neat, predictable pattern of damage. It just requires that the radiation has been affecting people, that the effects have been accumulating over decades, and that the population has been too dependent on the plant's economic support to ever seriously pursue the question of what those effects might be. And then there's the question of generational compounding. Homer and Marge both grew up in Springfield. Both absorbed whatever contamination the plant was producing during their respective childhoods. Their children were conceived and born into a family line where both parents had spent their formative years in an irradiated environment. Whatever alterations occurred in Homer and Marge at the cellular level, whatever adaptations their bodies made over decades of exposure, those adaptations were passed along. Bart and Lisa and Maggie didn't just inherit a contaminated environment. They may have inherited bodies already partially adapted to that environment, bodies in which the patterns of mutation and adjustment that Springfield's contamination produces were already underway before they were born. This is how radiation exposure works across generations in the real world. It's not always immediately visible. It accumulates. It compounds. It produces effects that become more pronounced as each generation inherits not just the exposure, but the biological legacy of the exposure the previous generation absorbed. And Springfield has had generations living under those cooling towers, not just the current residents, their parents, their grandparents. The town that existed before the plant was built was one thing. The town that developed in its shadow, over decades of leaking and dumping and contamination cycling through the water table, became something else. The Springfield that exists in the show's present is the end product of that long, slow transformation. The yellow skin and the 4 fingers and the wide eyes aren't how these people were born. Or rather, they're how these people were born, because their parents were these people too, and it had to start somewhere. The contamination has been thorough, more thorough than anyone in the show ever stops to properly examine. And that might be the most Springfield thing of all, the fact that the evidence is everywhere and has been everywhere for decades, and the town looks at it every single day and never quite manages to see it. Take a slow, easy breath. Let your body relax. There's nothing you need to do right now except rest. The yellow skin, the 4 fingers, the wide eyes, the mutations in the river, the glowing billionaire in the woods, the safety inspector who falls asleep at the panel. It's all connected, and the connection runs through the same source it always has. Those cooling towers on the hill, cracked and patched and leaking quietly into the water table of a town that can't quite bring itself to look directly at the thing that's been reshaping it for generations. Take a breath, let the sounds around you settle. Let this next section come to you gently, the way a story does when you're just on the edge of sleep and it's coming in from somewhere soft and far away. What if none of it happened? What if everything we just discussed, the radiation, the mutations, the cover-ups, the three-eyed fish and the glowing billionaire, and the entire 30-some-year mythology of Springfield, what if all of it is the dream of a man who fell into a coma in April of 1993 and never woke up? This is the Homer coma theory. It is the most discussed, most carefully constructed, most emotionally devastating fan theory in the history of The Simpsons. And it begins, like most important things, with something small. A vending machine, a candy bar. A moment of ordinary bad luck that the show treats as a throwaway gag and then never quite finishes dealing with. The episode aired the 1st of April 1993. The title was So It's Come to This, a Simpsons clip show. The premise was straightforward enough. Bart, in the spirit of April Fool's Day, escalated a series of pranks on his father. The final prank involved taking one of Homer's beer cans to an auto body shop and placing it inside an industrial paint shaker. The shaken can, given to Homer in his unsuspecting state, exploded with enough force to put him in the hospital. While Homer was in his hospital bed recovering from the explosion, he spotted a vending machine across the room. He got up to get a candy bar. The machine tipped over. Homer Simpson flatlined. He entered a clinically documented, medically acknowledged coma. The show was explicit about this. Not a blackout, not a nap, a coma. Clinically unconscious. 7 weeks. The episode ends with Homer waking up. Bart, tearful, confesses at the bedside that the whole thing was his fault. Homer springs awake and immediately begins strangling his son. The family laughs. Everything returns to normal. The show tells you that Homer woke up, and you believe it because the show tells you, and you move on. But in the final moments of that same episode, the show mentions something that almost nobody focused on at the time. During his coma, Homer lost 5% of his brain function, permanently. The damage was done, the neurons were gone, and Homer's response to learning this was to laugh. Not from understanding. He explicitly says he doesn't know why he's laughing, but from some reflex that precedes comprehension. The family found it charming. The episode ended. The Homer coma theory, originally proposed and developed on internet forums, and then refined over years of communal analysis, makes a very specific claim. Homer did not wake up. Not really. What appeared to be Homer waking up was the beginning of the coma's most sophisticated phase, the phase where the dreaming mind constructs a reality coherent enough to be mistaken for waking life. Everything that has aired since that April 1993 episode, every episode across 30-plus subsequent seasons, every storyline and guest appearance and character development and impossible event, is the dream of a man lying in a hospital bed in Springfield General, his brain slowly dimming, generating an increasingly elaborate simulation of the life he wishes he were living. The evidence for this theory is genuinely extensive, and it accumulates in ways that are difficult to dismiss. Start with the tonal shift. Before the coma episode, The Simpsons was a grounded show. Not realistic in a documentary sense, always stylized and comedic, but its stories drew from a recognizable well of human experience. Homer tried to quit drinking and found it harder than he expected. Marge wrestled with questions about her own identity and desires outside of her role as wife and mother. Bart struggled academically and faced real consequences for his behavior. Lisa developed a crush on a substitute teacher and experienced the particular kind of heartache that comes when you idolize someone who turns out to be merely human. These are stories about the ordinary difficulties of family life, observed through a satirical lens but rooted in the kind of situations real families navigate. After the coma, the show becomes something else. Homer goes to space, not as a dream sequence, not as a fantasy segment, as a canonical plot where Homer Simpson is launched into orbit aboard the space shuttle. Homer becomes a vigilante group leader. Homer joins a secret society. Homer discovers that his mother is a fugitive radical who has been living underground for decades. Homer meets God in a direct face-to-face conversation, not once but twice across the series. Homer befriends presidents, musicians, actors, athletes, and cultural figures of every description. He holds hundreds of different jobs. He travels to dozens of countries, He survives physical trauma that should by any reasonable physiological measure have killed him many times over. The escalation is so dramatic, so seismic in its departure from the show's original register, that even viewers who have never heard of the coma theory have noticed it. The internet has been debating for 2 decades precisely when The Simpsons changed, when it lost something, when the stories got bigger and the characters got louder, and the emotional grounding that made the early seasons feel resonant and real began to erode. The coma theory provides a very precise answer to that question. The show didn't change because the writers changed. The show changed because Homer's dream got worse. As the years pass in the real world, Homer's brain in its hospital bed continues to deteriorate. 5% lost in the initial coma episode. More lost with every month that passes, every year that the physical Homer remains unconscious while his family ages around his bed without him. The brain in the coma is running a simulation, and as the brain running the simulation loses processing capacity, the simulation becomes less tethered to the rules of the world the brain once knew. The stories become more absurd. The plots become more impossible. The character does things no person could realistically do because the mind generating his story no longer has the capacity to accurately model the constraints of reality. This is why later seasons feel like a different show. Because they are. They're the output of a brain that started in one state and has been degrading ever since. Now, 6 months before the coma episode, Season 4 premiere, an episode called Homer the Heretic. Homer, in one of the show's most memorable theological sequences, has a direct conversation with God. They speak face to face. They discuss Homer's relationship with faith, his complicated feelings about church, his general orientation toward the universe. And during that conversation, God tells Homer something. Homer will learn the meaning of life. But not yet. His time, God says, is coming. 6 months later, Homer is in a coma. Within the coma theory's framework, God was not making a theological observation. God was issuing a timeline. Homer's conscious, waking life was 6 months from its end. Everything that happened after the vending machine fell is not Homer living his life. It's Homer dreaming about his life, guided somewhere beneath the dream's surface by the last thing a supernatural being told him before his waking mind went dark. God told Homer his time was nearly up. And the show, reading forward from that moment, confirms it. The aging problem is where the coma theory does its most elegant work. No one in The Simpsons grows older. This is the most discussed, most analyzed, most frequently cited continuity issue in the entire series. Every other explanation offered for it has structural weaknesses. The radiation theory argues that mutated biology prevents aging, which works as a broad concept but doesn't explain the mechanism. The standard industry response is that it's simply a floating timeline, a narrative convention of long-running animated shows, which is true but unsatisfying because The Simpsons has run long enough that the floating timeline has begun to actively contradict itself. But the coma theory has an answer so simple it almost aches. Nobody ages because they exist inside the frozen memory of a man who went to sleep in April 1993. Homer's children don't grow up because Homer never saw them grow up. His wife doesn't develop new lines or gray hair because the last image of her he holds in conscious memory is from the morning before the accident. His friends don't change because his recall of them is fixed at the moment the vending machine hit the floor. The coma dream preserves Homer's world the way photographs preserve a moment. The image doesn't move. The people in it don't breathe or shift or age. They remain exactly as they were when the shutter clicked. And in Homer's coma, the shutter clicked in April 1993, and everything since then is the same image, replayed and extended and elaborated, but never allowed to move genuinely forward in time, because time moving forward would require Homer to actually be in it, and Homer is not in it. He's in a bed. His children are getting older outside his room. His wife is developing the life that continues without him. The people he loves are experiencing the years he's missing. And in the coma, he can't know this, so his dream gives him the only version of his family he has access to. The version that was true on the last day he was really with them. Of course they don't age. His memory of them can't age. He wasn't there. The celebrity appearances in later seasons take on a different quality under this reading. Springfield in the early seasons was a self-contained community, relatively isolated, populated by recurring characters who existed in recognizable relationship to each other. The later seasons become something of a parade, famous names and faces materializing in Springfield with a frequency that strains even the show's established logic. In a coma, the brain doesn't fall entirely silent. It continues to receive stimuli from the environment around the body. The sounds of the hospital room, nurses' conversations, a television playing in the background, visitors talking at the bedside. The brain processes these inputs and incorporates them into the dream in distorted form, names and voices and fragments of cultural reference absorbed through the fog of unconsciousness and woven into the narrative the dreaming mind is generating. Homer's coma brain, lying in that hospital bed for years, decades, hears things. The names of celebrities, the voices of public figures, snatches of songs and news broadcasts and overheard conversations. And the dream takes these fragments and builds them into characters, into guest appearances, into the famous faces that keep showing up in Springfield. Every celebrity who appears in Homer's Springfield is someone whose name or voice penetrated the fog and was incorporated into the simulation. Not because Springfield is a place celebrities go, but because Homer's brain is doing what brains do when they receive external stimuli and have to make narrative sense of them. The show acknowledged the coma theory, in its own oblique way, in a later season. A scene was released as a supposedly hacked or leaked deleted sequence in which Homer wakes from a long coma, and the twist is revealed that everything outlandish since the early seasons was a dream. The scene was full-length, fully voiced, entirely produced. And then the show declared it a hoax, a fake, not real. The work of internet pranksters and not the show's actual content. But the production team made it, they animated it. They wrote it and recorded the dialogue and put it together as a complete scene. They engaged with the theory in enough detail to produce a full dramatization of its central reveal. And their denial came packaged inside a scene that depicted the very thing they were denying. Al Jean, the show's executive producer, addressed the theory directly in 2015. He said it isn't true. He called it fan speculation and declined to give it further weight. But he didn't explain why nobody ages. He didn't address the tonal shift. He didn't explain the God conversation 6 months before the coma. He didn't engage with the mechanism the theory proposes, the deteriorating dream, the brain in the hospital bed generating increasingly surreal content as its processing capacity diminishes. He said it's not true, and the conversation moved on. And the fans didn't move on, because the theory does something the official denials have never managed to do. It makes the show make sense. All of it. Not just the parts that feel familiar and grounded, but the impossible parts. The celebrity parade, the world travel, the hundreds of implausible jobs, the physical invincibility, the perpetual present tense that never advances. Homer can survive anything because nothing is actually happening to his body. His body is in a bed, only his mind is in Springfield. And his mind cannot kill him because his mind is telling the story. And the mind, even a damaged and diminishing one, does not write stories in which the protagonist dies permanently and the narrative ends. There's an element to the coma theory that earns it a different kind of attention from the other theories we're exploring tonight. The others are clever. The radiation theory, the immortality theory, the collective denial theory, they're well-evidenced, carefully constructed, genuinely illuminating about what the show has been doing structurally for decades. But the coma theory is something more than clever. If the coma theory is true, then The Simpsons is not a comedy. It's a tragedy. The most beautiful, most sustained, most quietly devastating meditation on loss ever produced in the history of animated television. A man who wanted nothing complicated, nothing grand, nothing that would require him to be a different person than he was. Just his family, his house, his couch, his cold beer, his children making noise in the next room, his wife reading in the lamplight. That was all Homer Simpson ever really wanted. And in the coma, he has it. He has it forever. His children are always young, his wife's hair is always up, the house is always warm, the beer is always cold, the couch is always there, and the opening theme always plays, and everything always comes back to the same place by the end of the episode. Homer's coma isn't a nightmare. Given the terms of his specific life, his specific desires, his specific version of what happiness looks like, the coma might be the best thing that ever happened to him. It gave him a heaven customized to his specifications. A house on Evergreen Terrace where the kids are always laughing and nobody ever has to grow up or move away or get old enough to not need him anymore. And every time the story resets, every time the end credits roll and the world returns to its familiar configuration, it isn't lazy writing. It's Homer's brain refusing to let the story end. Because if the story ends, if the dream collapses, If Homer's mind finally exhausts itself and goes dark, then there's only one alternative. Either he wakes up and discovers how many years have passed without him, how old his children really are, whether Marge waited, whether she's still sitting beside the bed, or whether she eventually had to let go. How much of his life accumulated outside the windows of the room where his body lay while his mind was living an endless summer on Evergreen Terrace. Or he doesn't wake up at all. Those are the stakes of the coma theory. Not intellectual stakes, not the stakes of solving a puzzle, but emotional ones. The kind that sit with you after the screen goes dark and the room is quiet. Homer Simpson has been dreaming since April 1993. Every episode you've ever loved was a love letter from an unconscious father to the family he can't reach. Every joke, every disaster, every impossibly warm ending where everything is forgiven and the family is intact. All of it is Homer's mind doing the only thing a mind can do when it loves something it can no longer touch. It keeps imagining it, over and over and over, getting older and stranger and further from reality with each passing year, but never letting the people he loves disappear from the story. That's the Homer coma theory. Go ahead and let your eyes close all the way if they want to. Let the room get softer. We have a lot more ground to cover, and none of it is going anywhere. Breathe easy. You're doing fine. Just let the story keep going in the background while you drift. We're going to talk about a mystery that the show offered an official answer to in September of 1995, and that has never, despite the official answer, felt entirely settled. Not because the answer is obviously wrong, but because the evidence around it is messier than the show wants to acknowledge, and the messiness points in directions the official resolution never adequately addressed. Who shot Mr. Burns? Before we even get to the shooting itself, let's establish what the summer of 1995 meant for this show. The Simpsons was at the absolute apex of its cultural presence. Not just popular, not just successful, but genuinely central to the American conversation in a way that very few entertainment properties have ever managed to be. The season 6 finale, the first half of this two-part mystery, was promoted as a national event. Fox partnered with America's Most Wanted to produce a tie-in special that treated the fictional crime as though it were a real unsolved case. The show's creators offered a national contest, real prizes, real stakes, inviting the viewing audience to submit their guesses about who pulled the trigger. This was unprecedented for an animated series, a genuine whodunit mystery, designed to be solvable from the clues embedded in the episode, aired on primetime television with the weight of a cultural moment behind it. And the setup was carefully constructed to deserve that weight. Mr. Burns in the lead-up to the shooting had managed to enrage essentially every person in Springfield. He had stolen the oil well that sat beneath Springfield Elementary School, redirecting funding that the school desperately needed and doing it without any legal or moral hesitation. He had manipulated the finances of Moe's Tavern to the point of bankruptcy, eliminating Moe's livelihood. His actions had caused structural damage to the Springfield retirement castle, displacing elderly residents including Grandpa Simpson. His construction had injured Santa's little helper, the family dog, a creature whose harm tends to translate directly into emotional harm for the Simpsons. And then, as a capstone to this campaign of community destruction, Burns built and deployed a giant mechanical disc designed to block sunlight from reaching Springfield entirely, ensuring that every resident would be completely dependent on his nuclear plant for electrical power, for lighting, for anything that required energy. He stole the sun from a whole town because he wanted more money. By the end of the first episode, every meaningful character in the show had a motive. Homer, because Burns had spent years being unable to remember his name despite Homer working directly under him for all of that time. This accumulated neglect had reached a point of genuine anguish for Homer, who invested enormous emotional weight in being recognized by his employer and received nothing but indifference. Bart and Lisa because the school lost its funding. Grandpa, because the retirement home was destroyed. Groundskeeper Willie, who lost his job. Tito Puente because the music program was cut. Moe, because his bar went under. Even Smithers, Burns' devoted assistant, who had been fired on the spot when he finally raised a moral objection to the sun-blocking scheme. An entire community's worth of grievance accumulated against one man. The public confrontation at the town meeting became a powder keg. Multiple characters were visible with weapons. The tension was genuine enough that the show treated it dramatically rather than purely comedically. And then Burns collapsed. A gunshot wound. He staggered to the town sundial and fell, his hands landing on two letters, W and S. From Burns's perspective, looking up from the ground, those same letters could be read as M and S. The show held that image, cut to black, and left America to wait through an entire summer for the explanation. When Part 2 aired in September, the investigation was deliberately comedic in its structure. Chief Wiggum ran the kind of inquiry you'd expect from Chief Wiggum. Smithers confessed immediately, which initially seemed like a resolution, except that when the timeline of Smithers' movements was established, it became clear he had been significantly drunk and had shot a completely different person in a completely different location. He shot Jasper in his wooden leg, not Burns. Wrong target. The confession didn't hold. Suspects fell away one by one, alibis were established, and then the police found physical evidence that pointed them toward Homer. His fingerprints were on the gun. An eyelash found on Burns's suit carried DNA matching the Simpson family line. Homer had perhaps the most emotionally resonant motive in the entire cast, because Burns's complete inability to remember his name had pushed Homer past the point of ordinary frustration into something closer to a genuine breaking point. Homer was arrested. He was close to being convicted. And then Burns woke up from his coma. He looked around the hospital room and identified his shooter, Maggie Simpson. According to Burns's account, he had encountered Maggie in the parking lot after the town meeting. He had attempted to take her lollipop. In the ensuing struggle, his gun had fallen from its holster. Maggie picked it up. The gun discharged. Burns was shot. The mystery was solved. The baby did it. Case closed. Except the contest. The national contest in which Fox invited viewers to submit their guesses had produced, according to the DVD commentary for the episodes, essentially 0 correct answers from the randomly selected sample reviewed by the production team. Nobody won. The prize was awarded to a randomly selected entrant who had not guessed correctly and who therefore received a cash equivalent rather than the animated episode appearance originally promised. The writers acknowledged that they were aware of exactly one person who had posted the correct answer to an online Simpsons forum on the night the first episode aired. But this person was using a college internet account, and by the time anyone tried to trace them, the account no longer existed. The one person who got it right disappeared before anyone could confirm it. Think about what that means for the mystery structure. The show's creators promised a solvable puzzle. They designed clues intended to guide the audience toward the correct answer. They built a national contest around the premise that the answer could be deduced from what was shown. And when the answer arrived, virtually nobody had deduced it. Either the clues were genuinely insufficient to point to Maggie as the shooter, or the answer didn't logically follow from the evidence the way the show claimed it did. Or the show changed its answer at some point during production, and the clues from the first episode were never fully updated to match. The DVD commentary for the episodes reveals that multiple different endings were fully produced and considered. Smithers was one, a complete alternate conclusion with Smithers as the shooter, fully animated and voiced. Barney Gumble was seriously considered at an earlier stage of the writing process. The writers cycled through possibilities before landing on Maggie, and the choice was not obviously predetermined by the narrative structure of the first episode. The clues themselves are worth examining closely. The sundial. Burns falls and his hands land on letters that, from his perspective, read M and S. The show presents this as the central clue pointing to Maggie Simpson. But Burns himself, when pressed on the matter, stated clearly and on the record within the show's narrative that the positioning of his hands on the sundial was not intentional. He didn't deliberately arrange himself to point at his attacker's initials. He fell. He fell awkwardly, as people do when shot, and his hands happened to land on two letters that happened to correspond to the initials of the person Burns would later claim was the shooter. The central piece of evidence, the dramatic image that anchored the season-long mystery, was explicitly described by the victim as a coincidence. Burns said so himself. The letters mean nothing because he didn't put them there on purpose. They're just where his hands landed. The gun. Before the shooting, Burns's holster was shown empty. The gun was already missing from his person before the confrontation. This tells us something specific about the nature of the crime. Whoever shot Burns used his own weapon, meaning the shooter was someone who came to the encounter without a weapon of their own, who found Burns's gun through circumstance rather than preparation, and who fired impulsively rather than as part of a premeditated plan. A baby finding a gun fits this profile. So does almost every other character in Springfield who wasn't carrying their own weapon to the town meeting. The gun evidence narrows the field but doesn't close it. Burns's last words before being shot. He said, "Oh, it's you." The flat, mild tone of recognition. Not alarm, not surprise. The way you'd greet someone you've encountered before and don't consider a threat? Does Burns know Maggie? Has he interacted with her in any meaningful way that would produce this recognition? The show doesn't establish a relationship between Burns and Maggie prior to the shooting. Burns barely remembers Homer, who has worked for him for years. The idea that Burns would see a 1-year-old child in a parking lot and respond with calm, familiar recognition rather than confusion seems difficult to reconcile with what we know about how Burns processes the people around him. "Oh, it's you." The words of someone greeting a familiar face, not an unknown infant. Now, Season 18. Multiple seasons after the mystery was officially closed, Homer makes a casual, offhand statement that he was the one who shot Burns. He says it on camera. Nobody reacts. Nobody investigates. Nobody reopens the case. The richest man in Springfield was shot, and Homer Simpson just admitted to being the shooter in front of witnesses, and the world continues without a single consequence. Within the show's universe, there are two ways to read this. Either Homer is inventing a story about himself for the purposes of seeming interesting, which is entirely consistent with his character, a man who desperately wants to be noticed and significant. Or Homer knows what actually happened because Homer actually did it, and the statement is the closest he ever comes to confessing in a context where nobody will take him seriously. If Homer shot Burns, then Maggie was not the shooter. If Maggie was not the shooter, then the DNA evidence, the eyelash on Burns's suit, the blood type, the physical forensics that pointed toward a Simpson could have been pointing at Homer all along. The connection between the evidence and the conclusion was always mediated by Chief Wiggum and the Springfield police, neither of whom have ever demonstrated the kind of investigative rigor that would catch a misdirection. The Marge theory deserves a place in this discussion. A number of analysts have constructed a compelling case for Marge as the actual shooter. Marge had every reason to want Burns out of the picture. He had destroyed her children's school funding. He had injured her family's dog. He had blocked the sun from her town. And there's a history between Burns and Marge that the show established in an earlier episode, when Burns became infatuated with her in a way that she found unwelcome. That history creates an interesting possibility. If Marge shot Burns, and if Burns recognized her as his shooter, would he name her? A man who had been infatuated with someone might protect that person, even after being shot by them. A man who held power in the way Burns held power might prefer a resolution that didn't implicate someone he felt a connection to, no matter how one-sided that connection was. The sundial by this reading wasn't Burns pointing at Maggie. It was Burns deliberately positioning himself near letters that would lead investigators to someone who couldn't be convicted. Someone too young to face consequences. Someone whose supposed guilt would close the case without anyone having to be punished. Chief Wiggum says it directly. No jury in the world would convict a baby, except maybe Texas. If someone in a position to influence the investigation wanted to protect the real shooter and bury the case permanently, pointing the evidence at Maggie was the cleanest possible solution. An infant cannot testify. An infant cannot be tried. An infant's supposed guilt answers every investigator's question while ensuring that nobody pays a price. And then there's the final shot. After Burns identifies Maggie as the shooter, after the investigation is declared resolved, the camera finds Maggie alone in the hospital room after everyone else has left. She looks around, she checks her surroundings, she confirms she is not being observed, and then she makes a small, deliberate motion with her pacifier that mimics the action of pulling a trigger. The show wants you to read this as a confession, as Maggie's private acknowledgement of her guilt, the quiet smile, the checked surroundings, the miniature recreation of the shooting. But watch it again, if you can, from a different angle. A baby mimicking emotion she witnessed, processing a traumatic event she doesn't have the language to express, replaying something she saw someone else do in the way that young children replay experiences they don't yet have the capacity to integrate. The motion could be memory, not admission. It could be a child reenacting something she watched happen, not something she did. The alternate Smithers ending was shown to audiences in a later clip show, introduced and then dismissed with a joke about DNA evidence and the O.J. Simpson trial. The joke was deliberate. The show was winking at the audience about the nature of evidence and the relationship between what evidence says and what investigators decide to hear. The OJ reference is specifically about a case where physical evidence pointed in a direction and the verdict went another way. The show is telling you, gently but clearly, that evidence and conclusions don't always have the relationship they're supposed to have. The mystery of who shot Mr. Burns was never properly solved. An answer was provided. The investigation was closed. The official story was committed to and maintained. But the contest nobody won, the clues the victim dismissed as meaningless, the alternate endings that were fully produced, the season 18 confession that nobody followed up on, the final image of Maggie that can be read two entirely different ways depending on your assumptions. All of this suggests that the greatest mystery in Simpsons history is exactly what Springfield's mysteries always are. Not unsolvable. Just closed before the solving was finished. The case is closed. That doesn't mean it was solved. And in Springfield, those have always been two very different things. Close your eyes. Let your breathing slow, we're going to keep going. You're doing well. The room is quiet. Let the story come in softly from somewhere comfortable. Charles Montgomery Burns should not be alive. This isn't a metaphorical statement. It isn't a complaint about a character overstaying his welcome or a narrative that has run past its natural conclusion. Within the established facts of the show's own universe, Burns's continued existence represents a biological impossibility that the show has been circling for decades without ever landing on a definitive explanation. His birth has been placed in the late 1800s by various episodes. Not estimated, not implied, not vaguely gestured at. The show has given Burns direct personal memories of events from before the turn of the 20th century. He has described first-hand experiences from the 1910s. He has referenced working relationships with historical figures who would have died before most of the show's audience was born. He attended Yale. He served in World War II, in a capacity the show politely describes as morally complicated. He knew Howard Hughes. He stole a $1 trillion bill from the United States government during the war and kept it hidden for most of a century. By the most conservative reading of the show's continuity, Burns is well over 100 years old. By the more expansive readings that take his various historical references at face value, he might be approaching 140. And he doesn't just exist in this state, he functions. He runs a multi-billion-dollar corporation with the strategic sophistication and operational efficiency that such a task requires. He manipulates local politics. He executes long-term plans that require sustained cognitive effort, financial acumen, legal understanding, and an accurate working model of a world that has changed almost unrecognizably over the course of his existence. His physical body is frail. His strength is minimal. A light breeze can, and occasionally does, prevent him from moving forward, but his mind is razor sharp. Burns is arguably the most strategically intelligent character in Springfield, operating with a ruthlessness and a long-term vision that nobody else in the show's cast can match. He has been doing this for longer than any human being should be capable of sustained consciousness. The show explains this, partially and glancingly, in the Springfield Files episode we discussed earlier. Burns undergoes a weekly medical treatment of such intensity that it causes his body to emit a visible green glow. This treatment is not optional. It's not precautionary. It is the specific biological mechanism keeping Burns alive from 1 week to the next. Skip the treatment and Burns dies within 7 days. No exceptions. The margin is absolute. What the show presents as a throwaway explanation for a ghost story setup is, on examination, a description of something extraordinary. Burns's body can no longer sustain itself through natural biological processes. He is being kept alive artificially through a recurring medical intervention that must be administered on a precise weekly schedule, using treatments that involve radiation exposure significant enough to cause visible physical effects. The man who owns the nuclear power plant, the man whose facility has been irradiating Springfield's water and air for decades, is personally dependent on controlled radiation exposure to maintain his own biological functions. He is not simply profiting from radiation, he is powered by it. His life runs on the same substance his plant has been leaking into the environment. This creates a closed loop of a particularly sinister kind. Burns needs radiation to survive. Burns's plant produces radiation as a byproduct of generating power for Springfield. The radiation that escapes the facility into the environment sustains the contamination that affects the town's residents. And Burns, uniquely among those residents, has the medical infrastructure to benefit from the radiation rather than simply absorbing it. His treatments harvest what the environment produces and channel it into a precise, managed dosage that maintains his biological functions at exactly the threshold required to keep him alive. Springfield's contamination keeps Burns healthy. Everyone else gets the unmanaged version. Now, the famous scene. The scene that appears on compilation lists and is quoted in discussions of the show with remarkable frequency. Burns visits a doctor who, after a comprehensive examination, delivers the following diagnosis. Burns has every disease known to medical science. Every single one. Simultaneously. The doctor explains this with a level of professional equanimity that is itself remarkable. All of Burns's diseases are present in his body at the same moment, but they exist in a state of perfect equilibrium. Each illness is being blocked from progressing by every other illness. They are all trying to kill Burns at once, and therefore none of them can advance, because the competition between them for biological dominance creates a gridlock that no single disease can break through. The doctor compares this to 3 people trying to walk through a doorway simultaneously. None of them can get through. Burns's diseases are all present, and all active, and all entirely unable to kill him because they're in each other's way. The doctor's conclusion is that Burns is both the sickest man in the United States and functionally indestructible, because everything that should kill him is being neutralized by everything else that should kill him. This is played for comedy. It's one of the show's most beloved jokes. But accept the radiation maintenance framework and the joke becomes something else. Burns's body is maintaining disease equilibrium not through any natural process. The weekly treatments are doing it. The treatments don't cure his diseases, they manage them. They adjust the conditions inside his body with enough precision to keep every illness in a state of suspension, balanced against every other illness, none of them gaining dominance, none of them progressing. It's not medicine in any conventional sense. It's nuclear management applied to a biological system. Burns's body is a reactor, and his medical treatments are the equivalent of adjusting the control rods, adding just enough of the right input to prevent any single process from running away and producing a catastrophic outcome. Smithers is not simply Burns's assistant. Within this framework, Smithers is a critical component of Burns's survival infrastructure. Smithers manages the treatment schedule. Smithers ensures Burns makes every appointment. Smithers monitors Burns's physical condition with the kind of sustained vigilance that borders on medical supervision. The show has established repeatedly that Burns would be helpless without Smithers, and not just emotionally helpless in the way an elderly person might struggle without consistent support. Physically helpless. Without Smithers ensuring the weekly treatment schedule is maintained, Burns would miss a dose, the disease equilibrium would destabilize, and every illness in his body would surge forward simultaneously. Smithers isn't devoted to Burns out of a complicated emotional attachment alone, though the show certainly implies that's part of it. He's devoted because he understands, perhaps better than anyone else alive, that his absence would be a death sentence. Smithers keeps Burns alive through logistical competence and meticulous scheduling, and that knowledge, the knowledge that he is the only person standing between Burns and a simultaneous onslaught of every known disease, is the real foundation of their entire relationship. The power dynamic between them is not simply that Burns is the employer. It's that Burns cannot physically survive without Smithers doing his job. Burns's historical references are worth dwelling on. The show has given him memories of the Gilded Age, not as something he learned about in school, but as something he experienced. He has personal recollections of technological transitions that most people only know as historical facts. The shift from horse-drawn carriages to automobiles, the development of electrical infrastructure, the emergence of early aviation, the First World War, the Prohibition era, the Depression, the Second World War. Burns lived through all of these. He wasn't a passive observer. He was active in the world during these periods, accumulating wealth, making connections, building the institutional infrastructure that allows his empire to function. Every dollar he has ever earned, every institution he has ever influenced, every political relationship he has ever cultivated was built with a longevity in mind that normal human beings cannot plan for, because normal human beings don't expect to still be alive a century down the road. Burns expected to be. He built his empire accordingly. He established the mechanisms for maintaining it not across years or decades, but across lifetimes. The nuclear plant is not simply a business. It's a monument to permanence, an institution designed to outlast the generations of Springfield residents who will live and die in its shadow while Burns remains. And his family. The show has occasionally gestured at the Burns dynasty stretching back long before Charles Montgomery himself. The Burns family wealth predates the Industrial Revolution. The family has been powerful for centuries, and in each generation, that power has been maintained with a continuity that normal generational succession doesn't explain. Children inherit wealth, yes, but inherited wealth diminishes, spreads, gets litigated and contested and parceled out among descendants. The Burns family fortune has not diminished over centuries. It has grown, concentrated, maintained in ways that suggest something other than ordinary inheritance patterns. The question the show raises and never answers is whether the extraordinary longevity that Burns has achieved through modern medical intervention was achieved by his predecessors through earlier methods. Before nuclear medicine, before modern pharmaceuticals, before any of the technology that currently maintains Burns's diseased biological equilibrium, did the Burns family use other approaches? Did they find different ways to extend their hold on life beyond the normal human term? The show doesn't say, but it does establish that the family's continuous control of their fortune across centuries is a fact. And that kind of continuity requires either extraordinary luck stretched across generations or something more intentional. Burns has come closer to dying than almost any other character in the series. Shot by a baby, hospitalized on dozens of occasions, collapsed, fallen, been abandoned in wilderness conditions, been poisoned through various means, suffered attacks both deliberate and accidental. He has been brought to the edge of his biological limits repeatedly across the show's run. And every time, he comes back, through infrastructure, through money, through the medical machinery his wealth provides, which ensures that no matter what happens to his body, there will always be resources to repair it, treatments to stabilize it, smithers to schedule the next appointment and ensure the next dose is ready. Homer survives because the show needs him to survive, because he's the main character and the narrative requires his continued presence. Burns survives because he has built, over more than a century of deliberate effort, a system specifically designed to keep him alive regardless of what the universe throws at him. Homer's invincibility is passive, a consequence of his narrative role. Burns's invincibility is engineered, a consequence of a century of investment in the infrastructure of his own continued existence. And here's the element of the Burns immortality question that lands heaviest when you sit with it. Springfield needs him to be alive. The town's economy depends on the power plant. The power plant depends on Burns's continued ownership and management. Burns depends on the treatments. The treatments depend on the medical infrastructure that his wealth funds. The whole system feeds itself. Springfield cannot kill Burns because Springfield cannot function without Burns. And Burns cannot die because dying would mean the system he built would finally have to answer for what it's done to the people inside it. He is the oldest man in Springfield, possibly the oldest man in America, kept alive by weekly radiation treatments, sustained by a fortune that predates the nation itself, protected by a devoted assistant whose devotion serves the function of keeping the treatments scheduled, surrounded by a population whose critical faculties have been too damaged by the plant's contamination to properly examine why their employer has been alive for longer than the United States has been a superpower. He is not immortal. Immortality suggests something effortless, something inherent to his nature. Burns is something more specific. He is too expensive to die. He has made himself too expensive to die. Every institution he's purchased, every politician he's invested in, every doctor he's retained, every treatment he's developed, it all serves one purpose. Keep Burns functional for one more week, and then one more, and then one more. Springfield will keep paying the bill for as long as Burns keeps the lights on, which, if his treatment schedule holds, will be forever. Rest your eyes. There's more to come, but we're not in a hurry. Easy. Stay where you are. Let everything be soft. The next part of this story is about a truth that a whole town voted to make illegal. Season 9. Episode 2. The Principal and the Pauper. The 28th of September, 1997. The episode detonated inside the show's fan base with a speed and a finality that surprised even people who had been critical of the show before. The backlash was not gradual. It was immediate, specific, and has never fully subsided. 28 years later, this episode is still cited in discussions of when The Simpsons lost something, when the writers stopped caring about what had been built, when the show betrayed the trust of its audience. But here is the thing that nobody who argues this position ever quite manages to explain satisfactorily. The episode didn't break anything. It revealed something. And what it revealed had always been true about Springfield, just never shown with this degree of explicitness before. The setup. Springfield Elementary holds an event to honor Principal Seymour Skinner's 20 years of service to the school. During the event, a stranger walks in. Nobody recognizes him. He introduces himself as Sergeant Seymour Skinner. He explains, a decorated Vietnam War veteran who was believed to have died in combat, specifically to have been killed after being captured as a prisoner of war in Southeast Asia. He survived. He escaped. He came home. He returned to his life. Except his life was already occupied by someone else. The man Springfield has known as Seymour Skinner, the man who has been running their elementary school, caring for his mother Agnes, interacting with their children and their community for 2 decades, is not Seymour Skinner. His real name is Armin Tamzarian. Before the war, Tamzarian was a street-level petty criminal with no particular prospects and no obvious future. He was drafted, served alongside the real Skinner, and when Skinner was captured and presumed dead, Tamzarian made a decision that would shape the next 20 years of his life. He came to Springfield to deliver the news of Skinner's death to his mother, Agnes. Agnes assumed he was Seymour. She was elderly, possibly disoriented, certainly in grief, and she needed her son to have come home. Tamzarian, who had never in his life had anyone need him to be anything in particular, just went along with it. He became Seymour Skinner. He took the name, the rank, the mother, the community standing, the identity. He built a life inside it. 20 years later, the real Seymour Skinner walked through the door of the gymnasium, and the charade collapsed. Now, here is what Springfield did with this information. The town held a meeting. Both men were present. The facts were established and confirmed. Everyone in Springfield knew, with certainty, that their principal for the past 20 years had been living under a stolen identity. The imposter was named. The genuine article was present and accounted for. The truth was undeniable and undisputed, and the town voted on whether to acknowledge it. They voted unanimously to keep the lie. Judge Snyder issued a legal decree establishing that Armin Tamzarian was, for all legal and practical purposes, the real Seymour Skinner. The actual Seymour Skinner, the war veteran who had survived capture and imprisonment and come home to find his identity occupied, was tied to a railroad car and physically expelled from Springfield. And the judge made it legally actionable to ever mention the truth of the matter again, under penalty of torture. Sit with that sequence of events for a moment. Not the comedy of it, not the absurdist heightening that the show applies to everything, but the bare structure underneath it. An entire community obtained definitive proof that a major public figure had been lying about who he was for 20 years. The actual person whose identity was stolen was physically present. The evidence was conclusive. And the community's response was to vote, collectively and unanimously, to sustain the lie, exile the truth, and make speaking about it a criminal act. This episode was criticized as a betrayal of the show's continuity. Fans argued that it destroyed Skinner's character by revealing that everything built around him over the years was based on a fiction. Harry Shearer, who voices Skinner among several other characters, stated publicly that he thought the storyline was a mistake. The episode is consistently ranked at the bottom of quality assessments across the series, cited as evidence of a show that had stopped caring about the integrity of what it had built. But that criticism misses something important about what the episode is actually doing. The Principal and the Pauper is not a failure of continuity. It's a document of how Springfield actually works. The show was just being unusually honest about the mechanism. Springfield has always operated this way. This is not hyperbole. Across the full run of the series, the town has demonstrated a consistent, repeated, structurally reliable pattern of choosing comfort over truth whenever the two are in conflict. What the Skinner episode did was show you the machinery. It showed you the vote. It showed you the legal decree. It showed you the railroad car and the physical expulsion. It made the process visible in a way that the show usually doesn't, because usually the reset happens off-screen, in the invisible space between episodes, and the audience accepts it without thinking about it too carefully. Every other time Springfield undergoes a catastrophe and resets to normal by the following week, the audience accepts it as episodic storytelling. The dome went up over the town in the movie, and the next time the series continues, there is no dome. The sun was blocked by Burns's mechanical disc, and by the following episode, the sun was back and nobody in Springfield appeared to recall the experience. Events that should permanently alter the lives of everyone who experienced them are absorbed and forgotten with a speed that strains any realistic model of how human memory and community life work. The official explanation for this is that it's just how long-running episodic television works. Each episode needs to be accessible to new viewers. You can't build infinite continuity burden into a show designed to run indefinitely. Stories need to resolve, and then the landscape needs to reset so the next story can begin fresh. This is true. And it's also, within the show's own universe, completely unexplained. When the radiation theory looks at this pattern, it sees cognitive damage. The town forgets catastrophes because the contamination has compromised the neurological functions responsible for integrating traumatic memory and connecting it to ongoing behavior. When the coma theory looks at this pattern, it sees the natural structure of a dream, where events happen without accumulating into a coherent, ongoing narrative because dreams don't work that way. A dream resets between cycles. Events in a dream don't build on each other the way events in waking life do. The Skinner episode offers a third reading, and it's the most uncomfortable one of the three. Springfield resets because the town chooses to reset. Collectively, deliberately, through a social contract that operates beneath the surface of daily life. A standing agreement that says, we will not acknowledge what happened, we will maintain the agreed-upon version of reality, and anyone who breaks this agreement will be removed from the community. This is not unique to Springfield. Small communities in the real world have a documented, research-supported capacity for collective denial. Local scandals get buried. Uncomfortable facts about community figures get suppressed. The official story of a place, the narrative that residents tell themselves and each other about what their community is and what it stands for, can persist in the face of contradicting evidence for a remarkably long time, sustained by the social pressure of collective belief and the costs of being the person who insists on the inconvenient truth. Springfield has this capacity at an extreme level. The community can absorb almost any reality-altering event and return to its baseline configuration within a week. Not because the events didn't happen, not because the residents have literally no memory of them, but because the social contract requires that those events not be integrated into the ongoing narrative of normal Springfield life. The town agrees to forget. Not individually, not through some biological mechanism, but collectively, through an unspoken consensus that is occasionally made explicit in ways like the principal and the pauper. The real Seymour Skinner was Springfield's canary. He arrived with documentary proof that the official narrative was a lie. He didn't arrive with bad intentions. He wasn't trying to harm anyone. He was simply a man who had come home and expected to find his life waiting for him, and Springfield's response to his arrival was to identify him as a threat to the established order, to vote on his removal, and to criminalize the truth he represented. He walked through the door. He told the truth. He got tied to a train and sent away. That's not a comedy beat about bad writing. That's a precise description of what happens to anyone in any community who insists too loudly that the official story is wrong. The social machinery for dealing with that kind of person is remarkably consistent across cultures and contexts. Dismiss, discredit, isolate, expel, and if expulsion isn't sufficient, make speaking the inconvenient truth a legally actionable offense. Springfield made it illegal to mention the truth. They didn't just socially suppress it, they codified its suppression in a judge's decree. And this is where the episode connects to every other mystery in Springfield's history. If the town can do this with Skinner's identity, what else has it done this with? If the mechanism exists, if there is a functioning infrastructure for collectively voting to suppress uncomfortable facts and exile anyone who insists on them, then where else has this mechanism been applied? The three-eyed fish, the radiation, the bodies in the basement of the power plant, the billionaire who glows in the dark, the safety inspector who sleeps at his workstation. Each of these facts, examined seriously, leads to a set of questions that Springfield's social machinery cannot afford to answer. Acknowledging the contamination means confronting the plant. Confronting the plant means challenging Burns. Challenging Burns means threatening the economic foundation that every Springfield resident depends on. The economic foundation collapses and the town collapses with it. So, the town doesn't acknowledge the contamination. Not because the residents are stupid, not because they're uniformly unobservant, but because observation, in this particular case, leads somewhere the community cannot afford to go. The collective denial is not laziness, it's survival. It's the town protecting itself from the consequences of its own situation by refusing to engage with the reality of that situation. Springfield forgets because remembering is too expensive. The dome goes up and then it comes down, and nobody talks about it because talking about it would mean talking about the pollution that made the dome necessary, and that conversation doesn't end anywhere comfortable. And so the show resets every week. Not because the writers forgot what happened last time, because Springfield voted to forget. The Principal and the Pauper is the only episode in the show's run that lets you watch the vote happen in real time. It externalizes the mechanism, makes it explicit, gives it dialogue and a courtroom, and a legal decree. In every other episode, the forgetting happens in the gaps, in the invisible tissue between stories. Here, it happens on screen, announced, and ratified, and enforced. That's why fans found it so disturbing, not because it broke the show's continuity, because it explained the show's continuity in a way that was impossible to unsee once you'd seen it. Springfield doesn't have amnesia. Springfield has a policy, and the policy is enforced. Anyone who shows up with proof that the policy has been violated gets tied to a train and sent somewhere the community's carefully maintained version of reality can continue without their interference. Armin Tamzarian is still walking the halls of Springfield Elementary, pretending to be someone else. The real Seymour Skinner is out there somewhere, on the other side of the community's border, the last honest man in a town that made honesty a crime. Take a breath. Let that settle. Easy now. Let your thoughts slow down. This next section is about the quietest member of the family, and the remarkable amount of evidence she has quietly accumulated without anyone noticing. Maggie Simpson does not talk. She does not walk reliably without falling. She communicates through pacifier sounds and the occasional very pointed stare. She is 1 year old. She has been 1 year old for 36 years. And in that time, she has shot a billionaire, led a daycare rebellion against an authoritarian caregiver, saved her family from multiple serious threats, demonstrated problem-solving capabilities that exceed those of most of the adults in Springfield, and has done all of this without speaking a single word to anyone who is paying close enough attention to notice. The silence is the point. But we'll get there. Let's start with the shooting. Not because it's the most interesting thing about her, but because it's the most famous, and because establishing the complexity of the evidence around it matters for everything that comes after. We've already covered the who shot Mr. Burns mystery in detail. We've looked at the evidence, the alternate theories, the holes in the official resolution. The official resolution says Maggie did it. Burns encountered her in the parking lot, tried to take her candy, his gun fell from the holster in the struggle, Maggie picked it up and the gun discharged. Burns was shot. Whether or not that account is accurate, whether Maggie was the actual shooter or a convenient fall guy whose age made her immune to prosecution, the aftermath of the shooting tells us something specific about Maggie that the show has been building on ever since. After the resolution, after everyone has accepted the official story and the case has been closed, and Burns has identified his shooter, and Chief Wiggum has declared the matter resolved, the camera finds Maggie alone in the hospital room. The family has left. Burns is presumably receiving treatment somewhere down the hall. The room is empty except for Maggie. She looks around. Deliberately. A slow, methodical visual survey of the space. She checks the doorway. She checks the corners. She confirms that no one is watching. And then she moves her pacifier in a motion that precisely mimics the action of pulling a trigger on a firearm. Now, that sequence of behaviors, taken individually, might be interpreted as coincidental or reflexive. Babies move their mouths. Babies imitate sounds and motions they've observed. These are documented infant behaviors, and they don't necessarily carry the significance that adult interpretation might assign to them. But taken together, that sequence requires something more than reflex. Looking around to confirm the absence of witnesses is not a reflexive behavior. It's a deliberate one. It requires awareness of the concept of being observed. It requires understanding that certain actions carry consequences when performed in front of others, but not when performed in private. It requires a theory of mind, the ability to model other people's awareness and adjust your own behavior accordingly. Developmental psychologists have studied the emergence of this capacity in children extensively. True theory of mind, the ability to understand that other people have mental states different from your own and that you can predict and influence those states, typically does not emerge in children until around age 4. Some research suggests earlier emergence in certain contexts. but it does not typically appear in infants. Maggie checked whether she was being watched before doing something she knew she shouldn't do in front of witnesses. She is 1 year old. That's not infant behavior. That's something else entirely. The Academy Award-nominated theatrical short known as The Longest Daycare is 7 minutes of Maggie doing things that a 1-year-old human being, by any developmental framework, should not be capable of doing. The premise is simple enough. Maggie is left at a daycare facility. Inside, she encounters a caterpillar in the process of becoming a butterfly. She wants to protect it. Another baby, a bully, wants to destroy it. What follows is a miniature action film in which Maggie outmaneuvers the bully, the daycare staff, and the facility's physical security systems through a sustained campaign of observation, planning, improvisation, and multi-step strategic execution. She reads the environment immediately upon arrival. She identifies the relevant threats. She assesses the power structure of the facility and determines who has authority over whom and why. She develops a protective strategy for the caterpillar and executes it across multiple stages, adapting when circumstances change and finding alternative approaches when her initial plans are blocked. She does all of this in real time, without speech, without apparent consultation with anyone, based entirely on her own observation and reasoning. She is also, throughout this, physically limited to the motor capabilities of a 1-year-old. She falls. She stumbles. She crawls through spaces that a walking child could cross in moments. Her body cannot keep pace with her mind, but her decision-making is essentially flawless. Every choice she makes is the correct choice given the available information. Every adaptation is executed with appropriate speed and confidence. She succeeds not despite her physical limitations but around them, finding paths and strategies that work within the constraints of what her body can actually do. This is strategic intelligence of a high order, the ability to accurately model a complex, dynamic situation, identify an objective, develop a plan, adapt when circumstances change, and execute successfully despite significant physical constraints. These are capabilities that are not common in adults and are essentially unheard of in infants. The show has directly tested Maggie's intelligence in at least one canonical episode, and the results pointed towards something well beyond normal developmental norms. The show handles this as a quick comedic moment and moves on, but the pattern has been established consistently enough across multiple episodes and multiple contexts that it cannot be dismissed as an isolated joke. Maggie is not a normal baby. She is not developmentally delayed, as her silence might suggest to a casual observer. She is something that doesn't fit easily into standard developmental frameworks. She is a 1-year-old with the cognitive capabilities of a highly intelligent adult. Now, the silence, Maggie spoke once, in a moment that the show treated as a significant event. Her first word was Daddy, voiced by Elizabeth Taylor in a cameo appearance that the show acknowledged as meaningful. She said it once, and then she went back to silence, and she has maintained that silence for every episode since. She is surrounded by noise. Homer is one of the most verbally voluminous characters in the history of television. Marge processes her worries and concerns and observations out loud and at length. Bart talks constantly, provoking and responding, and filling every available conversational space. Lisa lectures, argues, reasons aloud, expresses her positions on virtually everything with a thoroughness that occasionally alienates the people around her. The Simpson household is a wall of sound, and in the middle of it, Maggie sits, watching, listening, processing. The theory that the silence is not a developmental limitation but a deliberate strategic choice requires two supporting observations to make sense. The first is that Maggie has the cognitive capability to understand the value of silence. Given everything we've seen her do, this seems reasonably established. The second is that she has a reason, a specific and rational reason, to maintain that silence. Look at what happens to the intelligent women in her family. Lisa Simpson is brilliant. The show has documented her intelligence across hundreds of episodes. Her IQ is extraordinary. Her academic ability is exceptional. Her capacity for sustained reasoning, moral philosophy, artistic expression, and scientific inquiry is visible and documented and remarkable. And Springfield does not reward her for it. Lisa's intelligence has earned her isolation, mockery, dismissal from people who find her intensity threatening or exhausting, or simply incompatible with the comfortable rhythms of Springfield life. She speaks up and gets ignored. She challenges authority and faces consequences disproportionate to the content of her challenges. She tries to improve the world around her and encounters resistance from a community that has not chosen to be improved. Her intelligence is her greatest gift and her most reliable source of suffering because she deploys it visibly. She announces herself as the smartest person in the room, and the room responds by ensuring she knows how little that matters in Springfield. Maggie has watched this happen. She has watched Lisa fight for recognition and receive resistance. She has watched the most capable mind in her immediate environment be dismissed and undermined, and left alone with her saxophone and her books and her principles. And Maggie made a different calculation. Silence is protective. Invisibility is armor. When people don't notice you, they don't dismiss you. When they don't expect you to be capable, they don't prevent you from being capable. The things Maggie has accomplished, the shooting, the daycare rebellion, the countless small rescues of family members from immediate physical danger, she accomplished precisely because nobody was monitoring her closely enough to stop her. Nobody suspects the baby. Nobody watches the baby. The baby is in the background, in the margins, in the spaces where nobody is looking. And Maggie has made herself at home in those spaces. She has maintained the most effective disguise a highly intelligent person in Springfield could construct. She presents as exactly what everyone expects a baby to be. Passive, dependent, absorbed in pacifier and simple sensory experience. She gives the world no reason to pay attention to her, and the world obliges by looking elsewhere. Every remarkable thing she does below the radar. Every time she saves someone, the moment is registered and then attributed to luck or reflex or dismissed as coincidence. The family thanks the universe rather than the baby. The community files the incident in the category of unexplained good fortune and moves on. Maggie returns to her default configuration of apparent helplessness, and nobody examines the gap between what she appears to be and what she demonstrably is. Now, connect this to the radiation theory. If the plant's contamination produces varied mutations across the population, if it affects different people in different ways based on factors too complex to predict, then the Simpson family represents a remarkable spread of outcomes from the same environmental cause. Homer absorbed decades of radiation exposure and emerged cognitively devastated but physically resilient. Lisa was born to irradiated parents in an irradiated environment and emerged as one of the most intellectually capable characters in the show's universe. And Maggie, born into the same conditions, to the same parents, in the same house drinking the same water and breathing the same air, Maggie got something different from both of them. Homer's mutation diminished him. Lisa's mutation elevated her. Maggie's mutation, if it is a mutation, appears to have produced something beyond the scale that either of those categories adequately describes. Homer is what happens when the contamination takes something away. Lisa is what happens when it enhances what was already there. Maggie might be what happens when it creates something that wasn't there before. Not an amplification of existing capacity, something new. Something that has no developmental context because it didn't develop through any recognized developmental process. A 1-year-old with theory of mind, with strategic planning ability, with the capacity to observe a complex social situation, identify the power dynamics within it, develop a multi-stage response, and execute that response adaptively in real time. These are not things that happen in babies, they happen in Maggie. And then there's the coma theory reading of Maggie, which is perhaps the most emotionally affecting of all the interpretations her character supports. If Homer is dreaming, if every episode since April 1993 is the product of an unconscious father lying in a hospital bed trying to hold on to his family, then Maggie's genius is Homer's love, given form. He cannot see her grow up. He cannot watch her first steps or hear her first real sentences or observe the person she becomes as the years pass. He is lying in a bed and she is somewhere outside that bed, aging without him, becoming someone he will never know. He can't give her anything real. He can't protect her or guide her or prepare her for the world that's already beginning to shape her in his absence. So in the dream, he makes her extraordinary. He gives her an intelligence that transcends her age, that protects her from the limitations of her body, that ensures she can take care of herself even when nobody around her realizes she needs no taking care of. He creates a version of his youngest child that can survive anything, handle anything, navigate any difficulty that Springfield throws at her. Not because she needed rescuing, because he needed to believe she'd be okay without him. Her genius isn't a mutation, it's a prayer. A dreaming father's prayer for the child he couldn't stay awake to raise. Back in the waking world, if such a place still exists in relation to Springfield, the practical question is what Maggie is waiting for. She watches everything. She has been watching for 36 years. She understands the power structures of her family and her town with a clarity that nobody else in Springfield possesses, because she has the cognitive capacity to see them clearly, and she has maintained the strategic silence required to observe without interfering with what she observes. She knows what the plant has done to the town. She knows what Burns has done to her family. She knows who shot who and who covered it up, and who made deals with whom and what those deals cost the people who made them. She knows all of it, and she hasn't spoken. The show's various flash-forward episodes have given partial glimpses of who Maggie might become. The specific content varies, but the consistent suggestion is someone who carries the full weight of what she's observed without being diminished by it. Someone who has spent a childhood accumulating knowledge that most adults in Springfield would find overwhelming. Maggie Simpson is 1 year old. She cannot reliably walk without falling. She cannot form sentences. She cannot, by any conventional developmental measure, understand the world she lives in. She understands it more completely than anyone else in Springfield. She just hasn't decided what to do about it yet. And that, perhaps more than the shooting or the daycare rebellion or the Academy Award nomination or the intelligence tests that go off the charts, is the most remarkable thing about her. Not what she's done. What she's waiting to do? Behind that pacifier, behind those enormous eyes, behind 36 years of deliberate silence, something is thinking, something is planning, something is watching the family and the town and the cracked cooling towers with a mind that nobody suspects, mapping a situation that nobody else fully understands, and waiting for a moment that hasn't arrived yet. When Maggie finally breaks her silence, Springfield won't see it coming. That's exactly how she designed it. Gentle breath. Let your body settle into wherever you're resting. This next section starts with a woman who almost nobody in Springfield thinks about, and who might be the most important character in the entire mythology of this show. For the first 6 seasons of The Simpsons, Homer's mother was dead. That was the official story. Abe Simpson, Homer's father, told him his mother had died when Homer was young. He showed Homer a grave. Homer mourned a loss he had no memories of experiencing firsthand, and grew up with the particular shape of grief that comes from losing something before you were old enough to understand what you were losing. A ghost absence. The outline of someone who should have been there. That absence shaped Homer Simpson more thoroughly than any other single fact about his life. His desperate need to be loved and recognized. His terror of abandonment. The clinginess he shows toward Marge. The way he holds on to his family with an intensity that occasionally borders on suffocation. The willingness to endure humiliation and mistreatment from his employer rather than risk losing the one stable structure he has. The compulsive need to be liked by everyone around him, to be remembered and acknowledged, to not be forgotten. Homer Simpson's entire emotional architecture is a coping mechanism for maternal loss. Every quirk, every excessive response to minor emotional slights, every moment of desperate affection, it all flows from the same source. A child whose mother disappeared before he was old enough to understand why. And in season 7, the show revealed that the loss was a lie. His mother was alive. The episode is called Mother Simpson. It aired the 19th of November, 1995, and it is consistently cited among the finest episodes in the show's history, not for its comedy but for the emotional weight it carries with unusual directness. The show does not approach this story through satire or absurdism. It approaches it as a story about a man learning that the most foundational grief of his life was built on a fiction. Here's what Homer discovers. The grave Abe showed him belonged to Walt Whitman, the poet. Abe Simpson had been using a famous dead writer's headstone as a stand-in for his wife's non-existent burial site, and Homer spent his entire life visiting the grave of someone who had nothing to do with his family. Homer finds Mona at the actual cemetery, visiting what she believes is her son's grave, because she received false information indicating that Homer had died. She doesn't recognize him at first. He's grown. He's become who he became in her absence, which is someone she never had the chance to shape or know. But when Homer establishes who he is, the reunion is one of the few moments in the show's long run where the comedy is set entirely aside, and what's left is just the weight of time and loss and love that persisted across both without anywhere to go. And then Mona tells Homer why she left, or rather, why she was forced to leave. And this is where the story stops being a personal family narrative and becomes something larger, something that connects Homer's life, Burns's empire, and the entire history of the Simpson family into a single thread. 1969. Mona Simpson was a housewife. She was married to Abe. She had a young son named Homer. She was living an ordinary, quiet life in Springfield, while the world outside was undergoing the most dramatic cultural upheaval of the 20th century. Civil rights, counterculture, anti-war protest, the sense that the social architecture of American life was being pulled apart and rebuilt along different lines. Mona was radicalized. The show depicts this with its characteristic combination of comedic stylization and genuine emotional honesty. She joined a group of activists, people who believed that direct action against institutional power was both morally required and practically necessary. And they targeted a specific facility, a biological weapons laboratory, owned by Mr. Burns, not just the nuclear power plant, not just the reactor that we've been discussing as the source of Springfield's contamination. Before that, before the nuclear plant was the dominant fact of Springfield's industrial landscape, Burns owned a germ warfare facility, a laboratory designed to develop and store weaponized biological agents. In Springfield, the same town where families were raising children, the same town where Mona Simpson was living with her husband and her young son, Burns was manufacturing weapons-grade pathogens in the community where Homer Simpson was growing up. Mona's group broke into the facility. They detonated what the show describes as an antibiotic bomb, a device designed to destroy the biological material stored inside the lab without endangering the surrounding area. The operation was, by its intended objectives, successful. The agents were destroyed. The lab's primary function was disrupted. During the escape, Mona made one mistake. She stopped to help someone who had been knocked down in the chaos. The person she stopped to help was Mr. Burns. She stopped to help the man whose weapons she had just destroyed. She helped him get up. She held his arm. She looked directly at his face. And Burns saw her. He identified her. He reported her to the FBI. And from that moment, Mona Simpson's life ended, and her fugitive existence began. She couldn't go home. She couldn't contact Abe. She couldn't hold Homer, or explain to him what was happening, or tell him that leaving wasn't the same as not loving him. She kissed her sleeping son goodbye in the dark and disappeared. For 27 years. Homer woke up and his mother was gone. Abe told him she was dead, and Homer carried that lie through his entire childhood and adolescence and adult life, building his personality around the wound it left, becoming the person the absence shaped him into. Now, the conspiracy that runs underneath this story. Burns didn't just identify Mona to the FBI and move on. He maintained an active interest in her case for decades. The show makes this explicit. When Mona returns to Springfield in Season 7, Burns recognizes her almost immediately. He sees her through a cab window and calls the authorities. The FBI shows up at the Simpson house. Mona has to flee again. Homer has to say goodbye to his mother for the second time. Burns has been sustaining this persecution for 27 years. Not as passive bureaucratic momentum where a case stays open because nobody bothered to close it, but as active personal involvement. He spotted her. He called it in. He is still, decades after the original confrontation, invested in ensuring that Mona Simpson cannot return to her family. Why? Why does the richest man in Springfield, a man with more pressing concerns than most people can enumerate, spend the resources and attention required to maintain surveillance on a middle-aged activist who destroyed a biological weapons lab in 1969? What did Mona cost him that justifies this level of sustained, personal retribution? The lab was one facility. Burns has many. The biological weapons program was one strand of his operations. The cost of the antibiotic bomb, measured against the totality of Burns's empire, was not ruinous. He rebuilt. He continued. The nuclear plant came afterward, a different project, a different infrastructure. What Mona cost Burns was something he cannot price or replace. She cost him the thing that people like Burns find most threatening, and that is evidence that someone is willing to act against them. Not complain, not protest in the street, not write letters to newspapers. Act, physically enter his facility, physically destroy his materials, physically demonstrate that his institutional power does not make him untouchable. Burns destroys Mona's life not because she cost him money or resources, but because she demonstrated that he could be opposed. And a billionaire whose entire power structure rests on the assumption that opposition is futile cannot allow that demonstration to stand. If Mona came home, if she lived peacefully in Springfield, if Homer grew up with a mother and became the person he might have been with that foundation, then Burns's message of invincibility would be incomplete. The story would have the wrong ending. So Burns writes a different ending. He ensures Mona stays gone. He ensures Homer grows up with the wound. He ensures that the most emotionally central damage in Homer's life is damage that Burns himself caused, and that Homer never connects those dots because Homer's cognition, already compromised by the crayon and the radiation and the decades of Springfield air, is not equipped to trace that kind of systemic connection. Homer works for Burns. He has worked for Burns for his entire adult life. He earns his paycheck from the man who destroyed his family. And the show presents his inability to connect these facts not as a comedy of stupidity, but as a tragedy of damage. Homer can't make the connection. His brain doesn't function that way anymore. The very environment that Burns created and maintains, the radiation, the cognitive erosion, the fog, has ensured that Homer cannot understand the architecture of his own suffering. The connection between Burns and Grandpa confirms the depth of the conspiracy. The show establishes in a later episode that Burns had committed a crime and Grandpa discovered it. In exchange for Grandpa's silence, Burns guaranteed Homer permanent employment at the plant. No matter what Homer did, no matter how incompetent he was, no matter how many errors he accumulated, 742 by one count, he would never be permanently fired. His job was protected by a deal his father made with his mother's persecutor. Homer's job security was never about his performance or Burns's generosity, or even the convenient incompetence that keeps the safety violations unaddressed. It was a contractual obligation, brokered in secret between two men who both had reasons to keep Homer exactly where he was and never tell him why. And nobody told Homer. Ever. Not Abe, not Burns, not anyone with knowledge of the arrangement. Homer has spent his career at the nuclear plant without knowing that his employment was secured by a deal his father made with the man who forced his mother underground. 3 generations of the Simpson family, each one shaped by what Burns did in 1969. Mona, forced into exile, cut off from her son, spending 27 years as a fugitive because she tried to stop a man from manufacturing biological weapons in her community. She lost everything: her home, her family, her son's childhood, her own identity as a mother and a member of a community. Abe, left to raise Homer alone, presumably dealing with some version of guilt about the lie he told about Mona's death, making the deal with Burns that traded his silence for his son's job security, carrying the knowledge of what he'd arranged without ever being able to tell the person it was meant to protect. Homer, the inheritor of all of it. His mother's exile shaped his personality. His father's deal shaped his employment. Burns's factory shaped his body and his mind. He is the end product of a conspiracy that began 30 years before the show's present day, and he has not the faintest understanding of how any of it fits together. In a later season, Mona dies. The scene is handled with an economy and a directness that the show almost never applies to emotional content. Homer holds her hand. He watches her go. There are no jokes. There is no cutaway. Just a man and his mother, and the weight of 27 stolen years that neither of them can get back. The Simpsons is a comedy. It has been a comedy for 36 seasons. But underneath the comedy, beneath the gags and the callbacks and the Homer strangling Bart sequences, there is a story about a family that was systematically dismantled by one man's power and one town's inability to resist it. Mona fought back and paid for it with everything she had. Abe made a deal and buried the truth under it. Homer inherited the consequences and never understood why his life felt heavier than it should. And Burns won. Burns almost always wins. Because in Springfield, the man with the resources writes the terms on which everyone else lives. And the terms said that Homer Simpson would work at the power plant until he died. Because his grandfather made a deal. Because his mother made a choice. Because the richest man in town needed a compliant, cognitively impaired man in Sector 7G. And Homer was everything Burns needed before he ever clocked in for the first time. Let that rest. Take a slow breath. Let the room be quiet for a moment. Comfortable? Good. Stay easy. Let your breathing be slow and steady. This section is going to feel slightly different from the others we've covered tonight. We've been spending time in the darker corridors of Springfield's mythology, in the places where the show's cheerful surface gives way to something more complicated underneath. The radiation, the coma, the conspiracy that runs through 3 generations, the town that voted to make truth illegal, This section is about something that seems lighter on its surface but becomes genuinely strange the longer you examine it. The Simpsons has a documented history of appearing to predict things before they happen. Events, inventions, cultural shifts, political outcomes. The show depicts something as a comedic exaggeration of current trends, and then reality, years or decades later, catches up to the joke. The most famous example. In the year 2000, an episode titled Bart to the Future depicted a future in which Lisa Simpson had become the President of the United States. In that future, the outgoing president, Lisa's predecessor in the Oval Office, was identified as Donald Trump. The episode aired 16 years before Trump won the 2016 presidential election. 16 years before the event, the show used as a setup for a joke about the absurd trajectory of American celebrity politics. The internet's response to this, when the 2016 election results came in, was immediate and sustained. Screenshots circulated. Clips were shared by people who hadn't watched the show in years. The phrase "The Simpsons predicted it" became a cultural refrain that spread beyond the show's fanbase and into general circulation. People who had no particular investment in the show were sharing these images and asking the same question. How did they know? The list extends far beyond the Trump presidency. In 1995, the show depicted a wristwatch-style device that resembles a modern smartwatch, closely enough to have been cited as a prediction years before smartwatches became commercially available. In 1994, Homer traveled to space aboard the space shuttle in a storyline that predated commercial space tourism by decades. In 1998, a background visual in a science fair episode included a mathematical equation that appeared to approximate the mass of the Higgs boson particle, which wouldn't be experimentally confirmed until 2012. A 1999 episode depicted a theory about the universe being shaped like a donut, a torus, and years later, cosmological research identified radiation patterns in the early universe that are consistent with a toroidal geometry. A 1993 episode depicted a flu virus originating from Asia that spreads to Springfield, causing mass panic, supply shortages, and a frantic search for a vaccine. The episode aired 27 years before the COVID-19 pandemic. During that fictional outbreak, the show also featured killer bees arriving from Asia as a secondary crisis, which landed with uncomfortable resonance in 2020 when Asian giant hornets, immediately dubbed murder hornets by news media, were discovered establishing themselves in the Pacific Northwest during the actual pandemic. In 1996, a Simpsons episode included a joke in which the hip-hop group Cypress Hill accidentally books the London Symphony Orchestra for the same performance. That specific collaboration, Cypress Hill performing with the London Symphony Orchestra, actually occurred in 2024 at the Royal Albert Hall, 28 years after the joke was made. In 1998, the show depicted 20th Century Fox being acquired by Disney, a corporate merger that became reality in 2019. The list is long enough to be treated as its own genre of online content. Simpsons predictions, compilations, before and after graphics. The show's remarkably large creative output means there is always something new to add to the list as each year passes and reality continues generating events. And every time a new example surfaces, the internet cycles through the same questions. Is this prophecy? Is this conspiracy? Do the writers have some source of information not available to the general public? Are they time travelers? Is The Simpsons secretly a document from the future being transmitted backward through some mechanism we don't understand? The actual answer is considerably more mundane and considerably more interesting than any of those possibilities. Al Jean, the show's longtime executive producer, has addressed the prediction phenomenon directly and repeatedly. His explanation is stated simply and without any particular sense of mystery. When you throw enough darts at a board for long enough, some of them are going to hit the bullseye. The Simpsons has produced close to 800 episodes across 36 years. Each episode contains dozens of jokes, cultural references, satirical observations, and comic extrapolations of current trends. When you generate that volume of content over that extended a period, the laws of probability ensure that some of it will align with future events. Bill Oakley, who ran the show during several of its most celebrated seasons, put it more plainly. Most of these cases are coincidence. History repeats itself. The episodes are old enough that the cycles of human behavior they observed have simply come around again. Fact-checking organizations have systematically examined the most famous claimed predictions and found, in most cases, either that the connection is less specific than the viral screenshots suggest, or that the show was extrapolating from trends already clearly in motion rather than making a genuine predictive leap into the future. The Trump example is clarifying here. In the year 2000, the idea of a Trump presidency was not a prediction generated from nothing. Trump had been publicly discussing the possibility of running for president since the late 1980s. He had given extensive public interviews about his political ambitions. The writers of the episode were not reaching into the void and selecting Trump's name from the infinite space of possible future presidents. They were observing a trend, the increasing overlap between celebrity culture and political aspirations, and following it to its logical and absurd conclusion. Trump was already a known commodity in American politics. The joke was about the direction the country was already heading, made by writers who were reading the current cultural landscape and pushing it slightly forward. The Disney-Fox merger was similar. Media consolidation was an accelerating trend throughout the 1990s and 2000s. Large entertainment companies acquiring smaller ones was not a fringe possibility. It was the clearly visible trajectory of the industry. The writers made a joke about the logical extreme of that trajectory. 20 years later, the trajectory arrived at that extreme. The smartwatch was based on the observation that computing technology was getting smaller and more personal. The space tourism storyline was based on the fact that private space ventures were already being discussed in earnest. The Higgs boson equation either was or wasn't a deliberate reference by a writer with physics training, but either way, the Higgs boson was a theoretically predicted particle that scientists had been searching for decades. It wasn't an unknown thing that the show invented. The Simpsons writing staff has historically included a remarkable concentration of people with advanced degrees from elite institutions. Multiple writers have held degrees from Harvard. Others have backgrounds in mathematics, computer science, physics, economics, and political theory. These are not people making random guesses. They are highly educated, widely read observers of American culture who spend their professional lives analyzing trends, extrapolating patterns, and pushing the current moment to its comedic, logical extreme. They are unusually good at reading where things are going. They are not supernaturally good at seeing things that haven't happened yet. But here's where the debunking gets its own complication. Because while the statistical and analytical explanations account for most of the predictions, they don't account for all of them with equal elegance. Some of the apparent predictions are specific enough, detailed enough, that pure statistical probability starts to feel like an insufficient explanation, even when you account for the show's enormous output. The Trump prediction didn't just identify that a celebrity might run for president, it specified Trump by name. The episode's visual staging of the Trump presidency included an image of Trump descending an escalator in a way that visually mirrors the specific staging of his actual 2015 campaign announcement. The show didn't just get the broad stroke right. It got a very specific detail right, one that couldn't have been extrapolated from 2000 because the escalator entrance as political spectacle had not yet happened. The Siegfried and Roy episode depicted a white tiger attacking one of the performers. That specific attack, in that specific context, with a white tiger, did occur in 2003. The show didn't depict performing animals as generically dangerous. It depicted a specific type of attack in a specific performing context. That's a narrower target to hit. These outliers don't disprove the statistical explanation. A show that makes enough jokes about enough subjects is going to occasionally land on something surprisingly specific just through volume. But they do suggest that the phenomenon is worth looking at from an additional angle. Here's a different framework for understanding what The Simpsons appears to be doing with the future. The show doesn't predict the future. The show shapes the future. Not through supernatural mechanisms, through cultural influence of a kind that very few pieces of media have ever achieved at this scale. The Simpsons has been part of American cultural consciousness for 36 years. It has been watched by more people, quoted more frequently, referenced more consistently across more contexts than almost any other media property in American history. Its observations about American life, its satirical framing of political and cultural trends, its jokes about institutions and individuals and technologies and social patterns, have entered the cultural bloodstream of multiple generations of Americans. When the show depicts Trump becoming president in the year 2000, that image enters the public imagination. Millions of people see it. It becomes a reference point. When Trump's actual political ambitions develop over the following decade and a half, The Simpsons image is already there in the cultural background, making the idea feel familiar rather than shocking. The joke doesn't predict the event. The joke makes the event feel, when it arrives, like something the culture had already processed. It normalizes the possibility. It primes the imagination to receive the reality as something recognizable rather than unprecedented. The show didn't predict the Disney-Fox merger. The show made the idea of massive media consolidation feel inevitable by depicting it as an obvious satirical punchline. When the merger actually happened, the cultural response wasn't shock. It was the specific recognition that comes when a joke lands as predicted. Of course they did. We already knew this would happen. The Simpsons already showed us. Springfield doesn't reflect America. America has been becoming Springfield. The show held up a mirror for 36 years, and the audience stared into it long enough to start resembling what they saw. The nuclear power plant owned by a corrupt billionaire. The incompetent government that serves his interests. The population too cognitively comfortable to examine how thoroughly they're being exploited. The endless cycle of catastrophe and reset. The collective amnesia that allows the same mistakes to accumulate across decades without producing accountability. This isn't a prediction of where America was heading. This is a diagnosis of where America already was, articulated with enough specificity and sustained with enough consistency that when the diagnosed conditions became impossible to ignore in real life, the show was already there, having already said it. The most interesting aspect of the prediction phenomenon, the part that stays with you after the screenshots are closed and the lists are set aside, is this. The Simpsons has also made thousands of jokes that never came true. Predictions about technology that never materialized. Political forecasts that went the other direction. Cultural shifts that happened completely differently from how the show imagined. Nobody takes screenshots of those. Nobody circulates the misses. Nobody builds retrospective theories around the predictions that were wrong. The phenomenon of Simpsons predictions is partly a phenomenon of confirmation bias operating at internet scale. A show produces thousands of satirical observations over 36 years. A small percentage of those observations align with subsequent events in ways that are noticeable and shareable. Those alignments get documented and circulated. The much larger category of non-alignments gets no documentation at all and simply fades. The result is a highlight reel assembled through selective attention that looks, in aggregate, like prophecy. But try telling that to the internet the next time a Simpsons clip from 1998 aligns perfectly with a 2025 news headline. Because the truth is, even knowing how the mechanism works, even understanding the statistical and cultural explanations that account for most of it, there is still something that makes you pause. 800 episodes, 36 years, thousands of satirical observations about the trajectory of American life, and enough apparent hits to make even the show's own writers occasionally wonder whether they've seen something they weren't supposed to see. The explanation doesn't fully satisfy. Maybe that's appropriate. Some mysteries are solved by understanding them. Some mysteries just get more interesting the longer you look. Close your eyes if they want to. We still have more to go. Good. Stay easy. Let the night wrap around you. Where is Springfield? This is the question that the show has been asked for 36 years. By fans, by journalists, by academics studying the geography of fictional American spaces, by people who just want to know what state the show is set in. The kind of simple, orienting information that every other American sitcom provides without ceremony. The Simpsons has answered this question dozens of times. Every answer has been contradicted by subsequent information. The contradiction has become part of the show's identity as surely as Homer's yellow skin or Bart's perpetual 10-year-old existence. Springfield has an oceanfront location. Springfield is landlocked and surrounded by mountains. Springfield is in the north, adjacent to Canada. Springfield is in the south, adjacent to Mexico. Springfield borders Ohio. Springfield borders Nevada. Springfield borders Maine. Springfield borders Kentucky. Springfield is accessible from a quick drive to a major coastal city. Springfield is a 12-hour drive from the nearest major metropolitan area. All of these facts are canonical. All of them appear in episodes of the show that are not presented as dreams or alternate timeline stories. All of them are treated as established facts within their respective episodes, and they are mutually exclusive. No real American state contains all of the geographic features and borders that Springfield has demonstrated over the course of the series. The town has a nuclear power plant, a gorge, a tire fire, a harbor, a monorail, a working mountain range, access to an ocean, a desert within driving distance, and occasional proximity to what appears to be Canadian wilderness. Springfield has weather that ranges from severe winter blizzards to tropical heat waves within a single season. Not consecutive seasons, the same season of the show's production year. The official explanation, confirmed by Matt Groening in a 2012 interview with Smithsonian Magazine, is that Groening named the town after Springfield, Oregon, where he grew up, and chose the name because it's one of the most common city names in America. The intent was to create a setting that could plausibly be located in any American state, a universally familiar name that would allow viewers from every corner of the country to feel that Springfield could be their town. For approximately 48 hours after that interview, the mystery was resolved. Springfield was in Oregon. Groening said so. Case closed. Except the show continued contradicting this revelation in subsequent episodes. The writers apparently didn't receive, or didn't adhere to, the memo that their creator had settled the question. Geographic information continued appearing in new episodes that was inconsistent with an Oregon setting. The answer Groening gave in 2012 was treated by the production as a non-binding statement rather than a canonical determination. The mystery was solved and then immediately unsolved by the people who were supposed to have solved it. This pattern, the show offering what appears to be a definitive answer and then quietly undermining that answer in subsequent episodes, is not new to the Springfield location question. It's the structural pattern of the show's entire approach to continuity. Give you something that looks like resolution. Take it away before you've fully settled into it. Return to productive ambiguity. The in-universe explanation that most analyses settle on is that Springfield's geographic impossibility is a deliberate design philosophy. The town is everywhere because it's meant to be everyone's town. Its contradictions are features, not bugs. A Springfield that could be conclusively placed in a specific state would be a Springfield that belongs to the residents of that state in a particular way that excludes everyone else. An unplaceable Springfield belongs equally to viewers in every state. Everyone can find something familiar. Everyone can feel the resonance of recognition. Nobody can claim it exclusively. This is true. It's the explanation the show's creators have offered, and it's supported by everything we know about how the show was conceived and how it has been developed. Springfield was designed to be universal, and its geographic ambiguity serves that universality. But apply the theories. If the radiation theory is true, if the nuclear plant's contamination has been warping the biology of Springfield's residents for decades, why should the rules stop at biology? Radiation, at high enough levels and over long enough periods, affects more than cells and DNA. It affects the physical environment. It changes materials. In the show's universe, where the contamination has been producing three-eyed fish and glowing billionaires and an entire population with shared physical characteristics that shouldn't exist, is it possible that the same contamination has been affecting the geographic and climatic properties of the region around Springfield? This is a genuine stretch, but it's a stretch that the show's own internal logic supports if you follow the radiation theory to its most extreme implications. A contamination zone that can alter biology might, in a fictional universe with somewhat loose natural laws, also alter geography. The mountains and the ocean and the desert all within driving distance aren't contradictions. They're the landscape responding to the same forces that produced Blinky, the three-eyed fish. More coherently, if the coma theory is true, Springfield's geographic impossibility is almost exactly what you'd expect from a dreaming brain. Homer has no detailed mental map of the United States. He has memories, fragments, impressions of places he's been and things he's seen and experiences he's had, mountains from a family vacation, ocean from a television commercial, desert from a movie he half-watched one afternoon, the Canadian wilderness from news coverage of some event he didn't pay close attention to. His unconscious mind assembles Springfield from these fragments without regard for geographic accuracy, because dreams don't require geographic accuracy. Dreams require emotional accuracy. The feeling of each place, not its real-world relationship to other places. Homer's Springfield has everything because Homer's memory contains impressions of everything, layered on top of each other the way memories layer, rather than the way a map organizes. You don't experience places on a map when you dream about them. You experience them as feelings, as textures, as the specific quality of light on an afternoon that stayed with you. And those feelings don't respect the distances between the real locations they came from. Springfield is geographically impossible because it's emotionally comprehensive. Homer's dreaming mind gave his hometown everything, every type of American landscape, every kind of American weather, every geographic feature, because home should contain everything. Home should be the whole world. The collective denial framework from the Skinner episode offers a different reading of the geographic mystery, one that's less emotional and more strategic. You cannot hold anyone legally accountable for actions taken in a jurisdiction that doesn't definitively exist. If Springfield floats between states, if its regulatory status is perpetually unclear because its location is perpetually unclear, then the entities operating within Springfield, most importantly the nuclear plant, exist in a condition of regulatory ambiguity that serves them enormously well. EPA oversight is tied to jurisdiction. State environmental law is state law. Federal enforcement of nuclear regulations depends on established regulatory relationships between the facility, the federal agency, and the state government. If the state keeps changing, if the regulatory relationships keep resetting, if nobody can quite establish which body of law applies to this particular facility in this particular location, then accountability becomes theoretical rather than practical. Springfield's geographic uncertainty isn't just a comedy device, it's a legal shield. The power plant with 342 safety violations, the facility that has been contaminating the water supply for decades, the institution responsible for the three-eyed fish and the glowing billionaire, operates without consistent regulatory oversight because the jurisdiction it operates in can't be pinned down. Landing means accountability. A Springfield with a fixed location in a specific state would be subject to that state's environmental law, that state's regulatory structures, that state's attorney general with authority to investigate what 342 safety violations have been doing to the population. A Springfield that drifts between states has no consistent regulatory authority to answer to. The violations continue. The contamination continues. The three-eyed fish keep swimming in the river. Burns benefits from Springfield's geographic ambiguity in the same way he benefits from everything else about the town's inability to pin things down. The ambiguity protects him. Not through active conspiracy necessarily, just through the convenient fact that a town without a clear location is a town without clear accountability. And within the logic of the show's collective denial framework, this ambiguity might not be entirely accidental. A community that votes unanimously to sustain lies and exile truth has demonstrated a capacity for organized self-deception that extends to every aspect of its existence. If Springfield's residents benefit, in a diffuse and perhaps unconscious way, from not knowing exactly where they live, because knowing would make them complicit in the regulatory failures of the plant they depend on, then the geographic uncertainty is another expression of the same social contract that lets them forget about the three-eyed fish after a news cycle. Don't ask where we are. If we know where we are, someone might ask what's in our water. And then someone might look at the fish. The episode Behind the Laughter, a mockumentary episode from the show's 12th season, finally revealed Springfield's location. Sort of. In the original broadcast, the family is identified as being from northern Kentucky. In syndicated reruns, the location was changed to a different state. The answer literally depends on which version of the episode you're watching. The show gave you the truth and then changed the truth depending on the platform. Even when Springfield has a definitive answer, the answer is contingent. It shifts based on context. It can't be held still. Springfield will never be located, not conclusively, not in a way that sticks across all contexts and contradictions and versions. The show decided long ago that the mystery is more valuable than the answer. A Springfield that could be anywhere belongs to everyone. A Springfield that belongs to everyone can never be shut down. And that might be the most Springfield thing about Springfield's location. The town is nowhere because being nowhere is the safest thing it can be. The contamination can't be regulated. The violations can't be cited. The fish can keep swimming with three eyes in a river that nobody has official jurisdiction over. Nobody can find it on a map. Nobody can knock on its door with a subpoena and a badge. Nobody can make it answer for what it's done to the people inside it. Springfield floats. And as long as Springfield floats, the lights stay on. You're doing well. Let the night be gentle. We're going to spend some time now with two characters who live in Springfield's background and whose stories, examined closely, are among the most unsettling things the show has quietly accumulated. The first is Hans Moleman. If you've watched The Simpsons for any length of time, you know him. He is small, elderly, nearly blind, possessing what appears to be an exceptionally limited quality of life. He wears thick glasses. He speaks in a thin, mournful voice. He exists, within the show's structure, primarily to suffer. He gets hit by cars, regularly. He gets crushed by falling objects. He gets trapped in enclosed spaces. He gets attacked by animals. He gets struck by lightning. He gets buried alive. He falls off things. Things fall on him. He encounters the infrastructure of Springfield, and the infrastructure consistently wins. He is, by any reasonable count, the most frequently killed character in the history of American animation. The crucial detail is that these are canonical deaths, not Treehouse of Horror, not dream sequences, not alternate timelines or hypothetical segments or any other structural exemption from the show's normal continuity. Hans Moleman dies in regular episodes, in the main narrative, and then appears in the next regular episode completely unharmed. No explanation is offered. No reference is made to what happened 2 episodes ago. He simply shows up again, still wearing the thick glasses, still driving too slowly, still walking into situations that are about to become unfortunate for him. The running gag reading of this is straightforward. It's the show finding a reliable joke structure and returning to it. A character whose suffering is always comedic because it's so exaggerated and so consequence-free. The audience laughs because nothing that happens to Moleman has any weight. He bounces back. He's fine. It's the same format every time, and the format is inherently funny. But step outside that reading for a moment and ask the question the show never asks. Why is he always fine? If Hans Moleman is a flesh and blood person living in a 3-dimensional fictional world, if he actually dies when a car hits him or a boulder lands on him or a wild animal makes him its dinner, what is bringing him back? Not healing. Healing is what Homer does, and Homer's recovery is superhuman but not impossible. Moleman's situation is categorically different. He doesn't survive his injuries and recover, he dies. His body ceases to function, and then he appears again. The radiation theory has a reading for this. If Springfield's contamination can produce 3-eyed fish, if it can alter biology in ways that have no precedent in normal mammalian physiology, if it has produced an entire population with shared physical characteristics that shouldn't exist, then perhaps for some individuals under some circumstances, it has done something more extreme. Perhaps Moleman's biological systems have been so fundamentally altered by whatever the plant has done to him that his body can reconstitute itself after death in ways that have no scientific framework in the real world. But that fall, within the internal logic of a universe where the same contamination has produced a billionaire who glows in the dark and a family where nobody ages. Moleman's repeated deaths aren't continuity errors. They're the most extreme expression of what Springfield's radiation can do. He dies. He comes back. Death in Springfield, for at least one of its residents, is a revolving door rather than a terminus. The coma theory reading is different and worth sitting with. If Homer is dreaming, if Springfield is the product of an unconscious mind generating a simulation, then minor background characters are dream furniture. They're the supporting props that the dreaming mind places in scenes to make them feel populated and real. They don't require the internal consistency of major characters because they're not sustained narrative presences in Homer's dream. They're scenery. Scenery can glitch. Scenery can appear in one configuration in one scene and a different configuration in the next because the dreaming mind isn't maintaining detailed continuity for every element of its constructed world. It's maintaining the characters that matter, the family, the close friends, and letting the background fill itself in with whatever's available. Moleman dies because Homer's dream occasionally lets him lapse. He comes back because the next scene needs something in that spot, and the dream recycles the available material. He's not a person in this reading. He's a prop that Homer's unconscious mind occasionally breaks and then reassembles because the simulation requires a certain number of bodies in the background to feel authentic. Now, there's one small detail about Moleman that is, on its own terms, the strangest thing about him. He stated his age once in a canonical episode, with no framing that suggests he was lying or confused. He said he was 31 years old. Look at him. By any visual assessment, Hans Moleman appears to be in his 80s or 90s. His posture suggests advanced age. His face suggests advanced age. His voice, his movement, his physical capabilities, everything about his presentation suggests a man who has been alive for a very long time and whose body reflects that accumulated time. He is 31 years old. If this is true, something happened to Hans Moleman that aged him catastrophically and premature. Something took a young man and produced the visible condition of extreme old age in him, while he was still decades away from the age where that condition would be expected. The radiation theory has an obvious candidate for what that something might be. Extreme radiation exposure is documented in the real world to accelerate cellular aging, to damage the systems responsible for maintaining cellular integrity, to produce in surviving individuals characteristics that, in normal circumstances, would only be produced by decades of natural aging. If Moleman received an extreme, concentrated radiation exposure at some point in his adult life, the physical effects on him would be consistent with what we see. Premature aging, severe enough to make a 31-year-old man appear octogenarian. Vision damage consistent with radiation injury. And then, perhaps, the same cellular changes that made him look so much older than he is also made him effectively indestructible in ways that contradict his apparent frailty. He looks ancient. He feels nothing. He dies and returns. He is 31 years old. Whatever Springfield did to Hans Moleman, it did it early, it did it thoroughly, and the results are still visible in the background of every episode he appears in. Now, let's talk about Ned Flanders. Ned Flanders is, on his surface, the show's explicit contrast character to Homer. Where Homer is indulgent, Ned is disciplined. Where Homer is careless, Ned is thoughtful. Where Homer neglects his spiritual life, Ned has built his entire identity around his faith. Where Homer is a mediocre father, Ned is an attentive and loving one. Ned is physically fit, financially responsible, emotionally patient, and relentlessly, comprehensively kind. The show punishes him for it continuously. His wife Maud died. Not as a background event. Not as a consequence of something she was involved in. She died because Homer was dodging t-shirts at a sporting event, and the t-shirts hit Maud instead. Homer's specific selfishness, his reflexive self-protective behavior in a minor and trivial situation, produced a chain of events that ended with Ned's wife dead at a stadium. Homer's carelessness literally killed the woman Ned loved. And Ned forgave him. Because that's what Ned does. The show has depicted Ned's breaking points. The most famous is the hurricane episode, when a storm destroys Ned's house and the community rebuilds it so poorly, so carelessly, with such indifference to structural integrity and basic construction standards, that the rebuilt house collapses almost immediately. Ned loses his home twice in the same story, and when this happens, something in him snaps. He screams at the town. He says things to every person who has ever wronged him that he has been suppressing for the entire duration of the show's run. He releases, in a sustained and extraordinary moment of raw honesty, everything he has been holding behind the patient smile. And then he's committed to a psychiatric facility, where it's revealed that Ned's relentless niceness is not a natural character trait. It is the result of childhood behavioral modification. Ned was, as a small child, violently uncontrollable. His parents, being committed countercultural nonconformists, who rejected all forms of discipline as oppressive, did nothing to address this. Eventually, they took him to a psychiatrist who, through years of intensive behavioral therapy, conditioned the aggression out of him, removed it, suppressed it so thoroughly that Ned Flanders grew into adulthood as a man who literally cannot access his own anger. It's there. The hurricane episode proved it's there, waiting behind the cheerfulness, waiting behind the high diddly-ho, neighborino, and the careful observance of religious practice, and the patient tolerance of Homer's sustained obliviousness. But accessing it requires the kind of sustained catastrophic provocation that it took a destroyed house to generate. His kindness isn't spiritual virtue, it's a cage, built around him by a psychiatrist when he was young enough that it became part of the architecture of who he is. He didn't choose to be this patient or this forgiving or this willing to absorb punishment without retaliation. He was made this way by an external intervention he didn't consent to, because he wasn't old enough to consent to anything. And the show's universe rewards this in a specific way that becomes genuinely troubling the more you examine it. God speaks to Homer. This is canonical. Homer has direct conversations with God, face to face, on multiple occasions across the show's run. God talks to Homer about football games and about faith and about the meaning of existence and about Homer's specific life situation. God is present, communicative, and engaged with Homer Simpson's inner life. God ignores Ned Flanders. In all of the show's run, across all of the episodes that involve Ned's faith, his prayer life, his consistent and devoted religious practice, God has not spoken to Ned. Not once. Ned builds his entire identity around his relationship with the divine, and the divine has apparently been having regular conversations with his neighbor while giving Ned complete silence. The drunk who sleeps through services and barely knows the words to hymns gets divine conversation. The man who has dedicated his life to faith and practice and sincere devotion gets nothing. This is the show's thesis about how the universe works. Goodness, within Springfield's moral logic, is not rewarded. Kindness is not protected. Faith is not answered. Compliance, even the most sincere and deeply felt compliance, does not produce the outcomes that compliance is supposed to produce. Ned is the most compliant person in Springfield. He was made to be compliant before he was old enough to make the choice. And his reward is a dead wife, a destroyed house, a neighbor who will never genuinely appreciate him, and a God who apparently finds Homer more interesting. Homer is the least compliant person in Springfield, at least in the sense that his compliance is not principled. He doesn't follow rules because he believes in them. He follows them, when he does, out of fear of consequences, and he breaks them constantly. He gets away with everything. His disasters are comic. His worst impulses produce outcomes that, by the end of each episode, have been absorbed and forgiven and forgotten. He falls, he breaks things, he causes harm, and by the next morning everything is reset. There's a reading of Ned and Homer as a pair that the show maintains across all 36 seasons without ever making explicit. Ned represents the promise that doing things right will produce good outcomes. Homer represents the reality that doing things wrong produces consequences no more severe than doing things right. They live next door to each other, so close that their backyards share a fence for decades, and the gap between their experiences, between the reward Ned receives for his goodness and the reward Homer receives for his carelessness, never closes. Because the system isn't designed to close it. Springfield is not a universe that rewards moral behavior, it's a universe that maintains equilibrium regardless of moral behavior. Ned suffers and endures. Homer suffers and bounces back. Burns manipulates and survives. Mona fought and was exiled. Homer's mother is dead and Homer doesn't know why his life feels so heavy, and Ned next door prays every evening to a God who last spoke to him never. That's Springfield. That's the system. That's the universe the show has been depicting with absolute consistency across 800 episodes and 36 years. And Ned Flanders, the nicest man in the show, is the character who makes the system's indifference most visible. Because he does everything right. He follows every rule. He maintains every virtue. He absorbs every punishment with grace and patience, and the behavioral conditioning that was installed in his brain before he had any say in the matter. And it doesn't matter. The system doesn't care. It never did. Almost there now. Stay easy. Let the words wash over you like something slow and warm. This is the last mystery, and it's the one that sits underneath everything else we've talked about tonight. Bart Simpson was 10 years old when The Simpsons debuted in December 1989. He is 10 years old right now. In whatever present moment this episode is airing, in whatever year the screen in front of you is displaying. He has been 10 years old for 36 years. He will presumably be 10 years old for whatever additional years the show continues to produce episodes. Lisa was 8 then. She is 8 now. Maggie was 1. Homer and Marge were somewhere in their middle 30s. They still are. The family exists in a permanent, suspended, unmoving present tense that the years of the real world accumulate around without penetrating. The industry terminology for this is a floating timeline. It's a standard approach in long-running episodic storytelling. The present of the show is always the present of the viewer. When the episode airs in 2025, the characters live in 2025. When it aired in 1995, they lived in 1995. The cultural references update. The technology updates, the political and social backdrop updates, the characters don't. They exist at fixed points, while the world around them scrolls forward. This is not unique to The Simpsons. Many long-running characters in various narrative formats operate under floating timelines. Comic book characters are perhaps the most famous example. Batman has been operating in Gotham for decades without aging meaningfully. James Bond refreshes actors while maintaining the same essential character without a coherent aging arc. Long-running characters tend to exist in a kind of temporal exemption from the usual rules. But The Simpsons has run long enough that the floating timeline has begun to produce visible contradictions at a scale that the convention of animated shows is struggling to absorb. The most obvious manifestation is the backstory drift. In the show's early seasons, Homer and Marge's shared history was anchored in the late 1970s and early 1980s. They met in high school during a specific era. Their courtship was framed by the cultural and social context of that period. This made sense. Adults in their mid-30s during the late 1980s would have had formative experiences in the 1970s. The floating timeline has been dragging the present forward for 36 years, and it has dragged the backstory with it. If Homer and Marge are still in their mid-30s in 2025, then they met in high school approximately in 2005. Their formative years were not the Nixon era and disco. They were MySpace and early YouTube and the Second Iraq War. The show has reflected this, uncomfortably and with increasing awkwardness, by simply redrawing their past every few years to fit the present. Their youth has been rewritten multiple times to include cultural references from successively later decades. They were hippies, then grunge fans, then something hazily millennial, each version more recent and more strained than the last. This is not a small continuity problem. Homer and Marge don't have a stable past. Their shared history is revised regularly to maintain the fiction of a permanent present. Their memories are effectively unstable. The facts of their relationship's origin are not fixed. They're a working document, updated as needed. Every theory we've discussed tonight arrives at this problem by a different route and proposes a different solution. The coma theory's solution is the simplest emotionally. Nobody ages because nobody can age inside the frozen memory of an unconscious man. Homer went under in April 1993, and his dreaming mind holds his family at the ages they were when he last saw them. The backstory keeps shifting because Homer's dreaming brain doesn't maintain detailed internal consistency about events from before the dream began. The memories float, they drift, they reconfigure around the emotional core, which is the family. Without maintaining documentary accuracy about the specific cultural period those memories are supposed to come from. The radiation theory's solution operates through biology. The contamination has altered the cellular processes responsible for aging in Springfield's residents. Whatever mechanism normally advances biological time in the human body, the degradation of cellular repair systems, the shortening of telomeres, the progressive accumulation of cellular damage that manifests as aging, that mechanism has been disrupted. Not uniformly and not identically across everyone, but consistently enough that the visible effects of time passing are suppressed in ways they shouldn't be. The collective denial theory holds that Springfield ages but declines to acknowledge it. The social contract the town operates under includes an agreement not to mark the passage of time in ways that would require confronting how much of it has gone by. Confronting 36 years of accumulated time would require confronting everything that has happened in those years. Every disaster, every reset, every impossible thing the town survived and forgot. The floating timeline is the denial extending to time itself. And Burns's immortality adds one more layer. If the richest, most powerful, most medically sophisticated person in Springfield has found a way to cheat death and aging through technology and wealth, then the concept of time passing and bodies changing is already demonstrably optional in this universe. If Burns can exist for 140 years without aging to the point of death, then the rules governing time and biology in Springfield are not the rules governing time and biology in the real world. All of these converge on the same conclusion. Time doesn't work in Springfield. And here's the larger thing the floating timeline reveals, the thing beyond the in-universe explanations and the narrative mechanics. The Simpsons is the American family. More specifically and more persistently than any other fictional family in the history of American television, these characters represent a specific vision of what domestic American life looks like. They are not realistic. They have never been realistic, but they are recognizable in the way that matters more than realism. Emotionally recognizable, culturally resonant, tuned to something in the American self-image that responds to them as familiar, even when the specific details of their lives are nothing like anyone's actual experience. Homer must always be middle-aged and harried and well-meaning in his failures. Marge must always be patient and hopeful and slightly long-suffering. Bart must always be rebellious and clever and fundamentally decent underneath the performance of defiance. Lisa must always be brilliant and idealistic and lonely, and convinced that the world could be better if the people in it tried harder. Maggie must always be silent and observant, and full of something nobody has quite managed to see yet. These configurations are not just narrative choices, they are cultural requirements. American audiences require this version of this family to remain stable. The moment Bart grows up and the show has to decide what a 26-year-old Bart Simpson looks like, the moment Lisa moves away to a university and Homer and Marge are left in an empty evergreen terrace, the moment Maggie finally speaks in a sustained and deliberate way, that means she's no longer the silent watcher, but an articulated person with an articulated perspective. The show stops being what it is and becomes something else. An ending. A story about a family that ran out of time. An elegy, beautiful and devastating, for something that used to exist and no longer does. America is not ready for that story. Or rather, America has been getting the other story, the story where the family persists unchanged for so long that the ending version has become almost unimaginable. We know intellectually that it would be good storytelling. We know intellectually that real families age and change and children grow up and parents grow older and everything eventually reaches its natural conclusion. We know this, and we have been choosing every Sunday evening for 36 years not to let The Simpsons have it. The floating timeline is not the show's choice, it's ours. We pressed pause on Evergreen Terrace in 1989, and we have been pressing it again every week since then. We are the source of the anomaly. We are the reason time doesn't pass in Springfield. We built it. We maintain it. We tune in every week to confirm that the walls are still up and the family is still intact and the loop is still running. And every time we watch, every time we laugh at a joke we've seen 15 years ago and still find funny, every time we quote a line from an episode we first watched when we were children, we tighten the loop a little more. The show has imagined Springfield without the loop. It has done it multiple times, in flash-forward episodes that show what the family would look like if time were allowed to do what time does. Lisa grown up and professionally accomplished, and still searching for the kind of connection that Springfield never quite gave her. Bart approaching middle age with the marks of all his choices visible in a face that looks like his father's. The house older. The street quieter. The sense of something having passed. These episodes exist. They're beautiful. They have a quality that the regular episodes, precisely because of their suspended quality, cannot quite achieve. They feel like something real is at stake. They feel like the story matters in the way that stories about loss and time always matter. And then they end. And Lisa goes back to being 8, and Bart goes back to being 10, and the loop resumes. Because we need it to. There's a version of the Homer coma theory in which the loop itself is the most compassionate detail. Homer is in the hospital bed. His children are aging outside the window of his room. Every year that passes, Bart grows further from the 10-year-old Homer last saw. Lisa's 9 becomes 10, becomes 15, becomes 20. Maggie begins to walk, and then to run, and then to develop into a person with a voice and an identity and a life. Homer can't know any of this. His brain holds them at the ages they were on the last day he was really with them. And that preservation, that frozen love, is the coma's one mercy. Homer's children don't age in his dream. They stay young. They stay the people he knows. They stay with him, perpetually, on Evergreen Terrace, in the house that stays the same and the neighborhood that stays the same, and the town that never quite manages to grow up or move on or let go of the moment it's been holding since a vending machine fell on a man in a hospital and the dream began. Maybe the loop isn't the character's prison. Maybe it's ours. The show we've been making together, the writers and the audience, through our engagement and our love and our refusal to let the end arrive. We trap them there, in the amber of our attention, preserved, unchanging, forever 36 years old, and forever brand new, in the way that beloved things stay new because we keep returning to them. Springfield doesn't age because we won't let it age. The Simpsons doesn't end because we won't let it end. And every Sunday night, or every night when someone somewhere opens a streaming service and starts an episode they've seen before or one they haven't, the loop tightens a little more. The family is on the couch. The theme is playing. Homer is driving home from the plant. Marge is at the store. Bart is causing trouble somewhere mild and recoverable. Lisa is sitting with her saxophone and her books, and her ideas that the world around her isn't quite ready for. Maggie is watching from the corner of the room, silent and enormous-eyed, and thinking something that nobody else is equipped to follow. We don't have to let them go tonight. We don't have to let the story end. Close your eyes. Let the room be dark and soft. Springfield is right where we left it, and it'll still be there in the morning. Conclusion. What Springfield knows about us. Tying every thread together. If you've made it this far, then you've spent a long time in Springfield tonight. We walked through the nuclear plant and counted the safety violations. We watched the three-eyed fish get pulled from the river, and we noticed that nobody asked the follow-up question. We looked at the yellow skin and the four fingers and the wide eyes, and we let the theory form slowly, the way theories do when you give them room to breathe. We sat with the possibility that Homer has been dreaming since 1993, that the dream has been getting stranger as the years pass, and the brain generating it continues to lose ground. We reopened the Burns shooting case and found that the official resolution, while convenient, leaves an uncomfortable number of threads dangling. We examined the immortal billionaire and traced the infrastructure he's built across more than a century to ensure that he never has to stop. We watched a town vote to make truth illegal, and we understood, uncomfortably, that the town is probably doing this all the time, even when the cameras aren't showing us the mechanics. We listened to Maggie's silence and heard what she's been saying in it. We followed Mona Simpson's story from an ordinary Springfield household in 1969 to its devastating conclusion, and traced the wreckage backward through 3 generations. We watched the show predict the future and then understood why the prediction isn't what it appears to be. We searched for Springfield on the map and found it everywhere and nowhere. We watched Hans Moleman die and come back and die and come back and ask the question the show never asks. We sat with Ned Flanders' quiet devastation and understood what it means to do everything right in a system that doesn't care about rightness. And we stared at the floating timeline until the loop looked back. Every one of these threads is different. They follow different evidence, use different logic, arrive at different conclusions, and every one of them arrives at the same place. Something is wrong in Springfield. Something structural and sustained and running too deep for any single explanation to fully account for. Whether the cause is the radiation or the dream or the collective denial or the billionaire's century-long reign or some interaction between all of these, the effect is the same. Time doesn't move. The characters don't age. The disasters reset. The catastrophes are forgotten. The truth gets exiled when it becomes inconvenient. And the family stays on the couch every Sunday night. Or every night depending on where you're watching and when and through what service and for what reason. The family is always on the couch. Homer is always just getting home from work. Bart is always 10. Lisa is always playing her saxophone in a room that doesn't quite contain everything she is. Maggie is always watching. Marge is always holding it together with the specific kind of patience that only love and accumulated habit can produce. The show has been telling you something for 36 years. It's been telling it quietly, through accumulation, through repetition, through the patient layering of detail on detail, until the pattern is undeniable even if the thing it describes can't be said plainly. Springfield isn't a cartoon town. Springfield is a mirror. The yellow skin and the four fingers and the nuclear plant and the billionaire who lives forever and the town that votes to forget its own history and the safety inspector who sleeps at his workstation. These aren't jokes about how absurd life can be. They're a portrait of a specific kind of American reality, the one where the systems are broken and everyone knows it and nobody changes it because changing it requires a kind of clarity and courage that the systems themselves have been designed to prevent. The radiation prevents clarity. The coma prevents waking up. The collective denial prevents accountability. The billionaire's money prevents consequences. And the family on the couch, night after night, provides the warmth and the humor and the familiarity that makes all of the impossible things feel, if not acceptable, then at least livable. Because that's what love does in impossible situations. It makes them livable. Homer coming home to Marge, Marge staying, Bart causing manageable trouble, Lisa fighting winnable battles. Sometimes, Maggie watching over all of them from her corner of the room, silent and extraordinary, and waiting for the right moment. The show will never confirm the theories. It will never say officially that Homer is dreaming, or that the plant is the cause of everything, or that Maggie is the most capable person in the family, or that Springfield's collective denial is the mechanism by which its impossible reality sustains itself. The theories exist in the space around the show rather than inside it, but the space around the show is where we live. We are the audience. We are the ones who return to Springfield every time, not because the mysteries have been solved, but because the love story underneath them is one we recognize. A family that keeps trying. A father who keeps coming home. Children who keep being worth coming home to. That's what the theories are about. Underneath all the evidence and analysis and careful examination of canonical details, they're about why we keep watching. Why we've kept watching for 36 years. Why Springfield feels like a place we know even though it doesn't exist and can't be located and operates under rules that don't apply to anywhere real. Because the family is real. Not literally, but in the way that matters more than literally. The love is real. The mess is real. The trying is real. And Springfield will be there tomorrow. Right where we left it. The couch, the television, the family, the loop running, as it always has, as it probably always will, in the town that doesn't age, in the show that doesn't end, in the dream that a father keeps dreaming because the dream is the only place his family is still young and he is still with them, and nobody ever has to say goodbye. Springfield will be here when you wake up. It always is. That's the whole point. Let's slow down here and spend a little more time with the economics of what Burns has built, because the financial architecture of Springfield is inseparable from the contamination argument, and it's more intricate than it first appears. Burns's monopoly over Springfield's electrical supply is not simply a matter of convenience. It's the load-bearing structure of the town's entire economy. Think through what happens to Springfield if the power plant closes. Every business in town that draws electricity from the grid, which is every business, either closes or faces costs that make closure economically identical to the alternative. The grocery stores, the bars, the schools, the hospital, the government offices, all of them dependent on a power supply that has one source and one owner. This creates a condition economists call monopsony when it applies to labor and monopoly when it applies to goods, but in Springfield's case it's something more total than either of those standard categories. Burns doesn't just supply electricity. He provides the economic reason for a significant portion of Springfield's working population to have jobs at all. The plant employs a meaningful chunk of the town. The suppliers who serve the plant employ more people. The businesses that serve the plant's workers employ more people still. Remove the plant and you remove the primary economic engine of an entire community. Burns knows this. He has known it since before the plant opened. The strategic genius of the nuclear plant, from Burns's perspective, is not that it generates electricity. Electricity generation is a means to an end. The strategic genius is that it generates dependency. A population that depends on you for its electricity and its employment and the overall health of its local economy is a population that cannot challenge you without threatening the foundations of its own survival. This is why the EPA's dome in the Simpsons movie is such a significant moment. The federal government recognized that Springfield was a contamination zone and took action, but the action they took was containment rather than remediation. They sealed the town off rather than cleaning it up. This tells you something about the assessment that was made at the highest levels of environmental policy. The contamination in Springfield was not treated as a problem that could be solved through standard cleanup approaches. It was treated as a condition so entrenched, so fundamentally woven into the physical landscape of the community, that the only viable response was isolation. You don't quarantine something you expect to recover. You quarantine something you've given up on cleaning. And the residents inside the dome when it went up were not treated as victims requiring rescue. They were treated as part of the contamination zone itself, to be contained along with everything else. The people of Springfield were sealed inside the dome, with their contaminated water and their irradiated soil and their cracked cooling towers, not because anyone thought this was good for the residents, but because letting them out would spread the problem. Springfield's people had become, in the federal government's assessment, indistinguishable from the contamination. They were not the population affected by the problem. They were the problem. This is the endpoint of what Burns built. A town so thoroughly contaminated, so completely economically and biologically dependent on the source of its contamination, that it could no longer be separated from what had been done to it. The residents aren't victims in the legal sense because victims can be extracted from the situation that victimized them. Springfield's residents can't be extracted because the situation is in them, in their biology, in their cognitive function, in the shared physical characteristics that make them look different from every person who lives more than a few miles from the plant's cooling towers. Burns created a closed system, not deliberately, probably not with this specific outcome in mind from the beginning, but the system closed around itself over decades, and now it is what it is. A population that cannot leave their contamination behind because the contamination is physiological. A town that cannot be cleaned up because the contamination has been running long enough to become the baseline condition of the environment. An economy that cannot function without the entity responsible for making it inhospitable to human life in any normal biological sense. Springfield is Burns's greatest achievement. Not the plant, not the wealth, not the empire. The achievement is this. He built something that cannot be undone. He built a situation that sustains itself. He built a dependency so complete that the town cannot reject him without destroying itself. And Homer, safe and warm in the fog of his cognitive impairment, goes to work every morning and presses the wrong buttons, and eats his donuts, and comes home to his family in the house on the street that the plant's contamination has slowly and irreversibly been reshaping since before Homer was born. There's a character the radiation theory demands closer attention to than it usually receives. Dr. Julius Hibbert, Springfield's primary physician, the man who has treated the Simpson family and the wider community through countless medical crises across the show's run, a figure who, within the show's own logic, is established as competent and well-trained. Not a quack, not a joke character primarily, a legitimate doctor who produces legitimate medical outcomes. Dr. Hibbert has treated Homer's many injuries. He has delivered diagnoses. He has performed procedures. He has been present at births and deaths and the full range of medical events that life in a contaminated community produces in abundance. He has the complete medical history of Springfield's most central family and presumably significant portions of the wider community's health records as well. And in all of those records, across all of those years of medical practice in a town with a three-eyed fish in the river, Dr. Hibbert has apparently never considered investigating whether his patient population's shared physical characteristics might have a systemic environmental cause. This could be explained as the show simply not being interested in that particular storyline. Medical mystery procedurals are not what The Simpsons does. The show is not House MD set in Springfield, and expecting it to function like one misreads its genre. Fair enough, but within the show's universe, within the logic of the world these characters inhabit, a physician with this patient base in this environment, not noticing or not investigating the contamination hypothesis, is itself a detail that demands explanation. One explanation is that Dr. Hibbert is genuinely limited by the same cognitive effects of Springfield's contamination that affect everyone else. He lives in the same town. He drinks the same water. He breathes the same air. Whatever the radiation has done to his patient's neural architecture, it has presumably been doing to his as well for the duration of his career in Springfield. His medical competence, his ability to treat acute conditions and perform procedures, might persist even as the higher-order pattern recognition required to see the connection between individual cases and their systemic environmental cause is subtly compromised. A doctor doesn't need unimpaired critical thinking to treat a broken bone. He does need it to look at a patient population with consistent, shared physical characteristics and ask what common environmental factor might account for them. The former is a skill that can survive moderate cognitive impairment. The latter requires exactly the kind of big-picture analytical thinking that chronic radiation exposure would compromise first. The second explanation is more troubling. Burns's influence in Springfield extends into every significant institution in the town. He has bought politicians, shaped regulatory relationships, maintained economic leverage over businesses and individuals throughout the community. Is it so difficult to imagine that this influence extends into the healthcare sector? That a physician in a town Burns essentially owns has some form of relationship, financial or otherwise, with the power plant's owner? Not necessarily a corruption in the dramatic sense. Just the ordinary accumulation of professional relationships and economic dependencies that make an otherwise conscientious person carefully not look too hard at things that would be inconvenient to find. Dr. Hibbert chuckles a lot. He's known for his distinctive laugh. This has always been played as a character quirk, a piece of comic business. But there's a reading of that persistent cheerfulness that becomes uncomfortable once you start thinking about what he knows and doesn't know about his patient population. A man who has found a way to be comfortable with what he sees every day. A man who has made his peace with the professional obligation not to pursue certain questions. A man whose laugh is the sound of not going there. The Homer coma theory lives or dies on whether you accept the proposed mechanism of the post. 1993 episode's increasing surrealism. The argument is that a deteriorating dreaming brain produces increasingly strange and disconnected content as its processing capacity diminishes. But let's examine what that deterioration would actually look like in practice, because the specific quality of the strangeness in later Simpsons seasons has a texture worth exploring. In the early seasons, the episodes that the coma theory places before or at the threshold of the dream, the show's impossible elements were largely contained. The implausibilities were gentle. The satire was grounded in recognizable types of human behavior and human failure. Burns was corrupt, but in ways that mapped onto recognizable institutional corruption. Homer's disasters were domestic and recoverable. The stakes were low, the comedy was warm, the family was the emotional center around which everything else orbited. After the transition, the scaling of the impossible accelerates. Not uniformly. Not every post-coma episode is a departure from the emotional register of the early seasons. The show still produces stories about domestic life, about the specific difficulties of raising children and maintaining a marriage and navigating work and community. But interspersed with these, with increasing frequency, are episodes of a different kind. Episodes in which the scale of the impossible is simply larger than anything from the early seasons, in which the rules of the show's world seem to flex or break, in which the family's experiences depart from anything that could be anchored in recognizable domestic experience. If this is a dream deteriorating, the deterioration follows a pattern consistent with what happens to dreaming brains as they lose processing integrity. The familiar emotional configurations persist, because those are the deep structures, the things the dream is fundamentally about: the family, the relationships, the love that the dreaming mind is trying to hold. But the world building around those configurations becomes less consistent, less coherent, more willing to bend the rules of plausibility in service of whatever the dream needs in the moment. Dreams don't get worse at feelings as the brain deteriorates. They get worse at facts. They maintain the emotional truths, the desire for connection, the fear of loss, while losing the grip on physical and logical consistency that waking thought maintains. The family stays emotionally real in later Simpsons seasons. The world around them becomes progressively less physically coherent. This matches the pattern of dream deterioration. Not perfectly, because nothing about this theory maps perfectly onto the show, but with enough fidelity to make the correspondence feel like more than coincidence. There's another element of the coma theory worth dwelling on that doesn't get discussed as much as the aging question or the tonal shift. The question of Homer's relationship to failure. In the dream, Homer fails constantly. He fails at his job. He fails at projects he undertakes. He fails at plans he makes. He fails his children in small ways, forgets things, misses things, falls short of what he intended to be as a father. These failures are the show's comic material, the engine of its plots. Homer attempts something, Homer fails, Homer course corrects, eventually, usually with the family's help. But in the dream, the failures never compound in the way failures in real life compound. They resolve, they're absorbed, they're forgiven. And then the next episode begins with everyone intact and none of the previous episode's failures carrying forward into new consequences. This is emotionally significant for what it tells us about what the dreaming Homer needs. He needs to be forgiven, over and over, in every episode, by Marge, by Bart, by Lisa, by the family as a unit. His failures are structured to be forgivable, to be exactly severe enough to generate drama but not so severe that they can't be absorbed by an end-of-episode reconciliation. The dream is giving Homer the thing he most needs, and probably most fears he doesn't deserve: perpetual forgiveness, perpetual second chances, a family that absorbs his failures and loves him through them and goes back to baseline every Sunday. That's what the dream is for. Not wish fulfillment of the obvious kind. Not Homer winning at life or becoming successful or being recognized for his greatness. The dream gives him something more specific: a family that keeps forgiving him, a wife who keeps choosing him, children who keep loving him despite everything. That is Homer Simpson's heaven. And it runs, on a loop, in a hospital somewhere in Springfield that doesn't appear on any map. When we talk about who shot Mr. Burns, we spend a lot of time on the big questions: the sundial, the DNA, the alternate endings, the season 18 confession. But there are smaller details in the two-part episode that deserve attention and rarely get it, details that complicate the official resolution without necessarily pointing toward any single alternative. The timing of the shooting, for instance. Burns was shot in a parking lot, according to his own account, after the town meeting but before he had departed from the general area. This places the shooting in a public space during a period when a significant portion of Springfield's population was still in the vicinity. The town meeting had just ended. People were dispersing. The area was not deserted. And yet no witness came forward. Nobody saw the shooting occur, or if they did, nobody said so to the police. In a parking lot full of people who were all deeply agitated about what Burns had just done to their community, with a shooting loud enough to be unambiguous, not one person claims to have seen anything useful. Chief Wiggum's investigation doesn't pursue this. He doesn't canvass the area for witnesses. He doesn't establish a timeline based on when the crowd dispersed. The investigation proceeds as though the shooting happened in a vacuum, with no ambient population nearby who might have observed something. This is partly explained by the quality of Wiggum's investigative competence, which is not high, but it's also the kind of evidentiary gap that feels like it should be noticed. The shooting happened where and when people were around. Nobody saw it, or nobody said they saw it. If the shooting was witnessed and the witnesses chose not to come forward, that suggests either that what they saw was something they had a reason to protect, like a person they cared about or felt sympathetic to as the shooter, or it suggests that community-wide social pressure operated in the parking lot the same way it operates everywhere else in Springfield, quietly and invisibly enforcing the collective decision not to look too hard at things that would require difficult responses. The DNA evidence pointing to a Simpson also deserves a second look. An eyelash was found on Burns's suit. The eyelash was analyzed and determined to carry DNA consistent with the Simpson family line. This was the critical evidence that shifted focus to Homer and then to Maggie. But consider the nature of an eyelash as evidence. An eyelash can be deposited on clothing through contact that is not related to a specific incident. If Homer had been near Burns earlier that day, if Marge had brushed past him at the town meeting, if any Simpson had come into physical proximity with Burns at any point before the shooting, the eyelash could have transferred then rather than at the moment of the crime. Physical transfer evidence of this type is notoriously difficult to associate with a specific moment in time. The eyelash proves a Simpson's proximity to Burns at some point. It doesn't prove when that proximity occurred or what was happening during it. Chief Wiggum's analysis doesn't make this distinction. The eyelash was on the suit. The suit was on Burns when he was shot. Therefore, the eyelash was deposited during the shooting. This logical chain has several weak links, and a competent investigation would have identified them. Wiggum's investigation was not competent, and Burns's identification of Maggie as the shooter from a coma. Burns regained consciousness and within moments of waking, identified his shooter as a specific 1-year-old child. Having been shot, having been unconscious for a period afterward, having sustained what would be physiologically significant trauma, Burns's first clear act of consciousness is a confident identification of his attacker. The reliability of trauma-associated memory is a complex area of cognitive science. The show treats Burns's coma recovery identification as unimpeachable testimony. It is probably the least reliable form of eyewitness account that exists. Burns may well have believed he was accurately remembering Maggie. He may also have been constructing a memory out of fragments and suggestion and the post-traumatic cognitive confusion that follows a significant injury. Or he may have been deliberately identifying Maggie because he had reasons of his own to want the investigation pointed in a direction where no conviction was possible. The case was closed, not solved, closed. And in Springfield, those remain two very different outcomes. Burns's self-awareness about his own condition is a thread that runs through the show with more consistency than is usually acknowledged. He is not a character who operates in denial about what his treatments are doing to him, or about the unusual nature of his biological situation. He understands his condition clearly. He manages it strategically. He has built his entire life around the management requirements that his century-plus of existence have imposed on him. This is worth distinguishing from how the show handles Homer's self-awareness, or lack of it, about his own situation. Homer doesn't know what the radiation is doing to him. He doesn't understand the connection between the plant's contamination and the cognitive fog he lives in. He can't access the architecture of his own suffering. His impairment is both the cause of his inability to understand his situation and the result of the same situation he can't understand. It's a closed loop of the most tragically perfect kind. Burns has no such limitation. Burns understands exactly what has happened to his body over the course of more than a century of radiation exposure. He understands what his weekly treatments are doing. He understands why they're necessary and what happens if they're missed. He has presumably watched his own biological condition evolve over decades as the effects accumulated and the interventions required to manage those effects became more intensive and more specialized. What does it feel like to be Burns? Not ethically, not in terms of the suffering he's caused, but phenomenologically. What is the experience of existing in a body that has been sustained past its biological limit through artificial means for more than a century? What is it like to need a weekly treatment or die? To carry every known disease in a state of managed equilibrium? To glow after the treatments? To walk out of the facility radiating visible light? To be mistaken for something other than human because the treatments that keep you alive also make you look like something from another world? The show doesn't ask these questions explicitly. Burns is, by narrative function, a villain. His interiority is not the show's primary concern, but the show does give him moments, occasional and brief, where something else peeks through the corporate ruthlessness. Moments where Burns appears to experience his own situation with something approaching awareness of its cost. He is alive. He has been alive for an extraordinarily long time. He has accumulated wealth and power and longevity far beyond anything most human beings will ever experience. And he is utterly alone with it. Smithers is devoted to him, but Smithers's devotion is, as we've noted, as much a function of professional necessity as it is anything warmer. Burns's peers from his youth are dead. Everyone who knew him when he was young is dead. Everyone who knew the world as it existed when he first moved through it is dead. He is the last person alive who experienced certain historical moments as they happened rather than as history. That's a specific kind of loneliness that no amount of wealth makes easier, being the last one left. Watching the world regenerate itself with new people who have no memory of what came before, who can't share the reference points of a life that's been running since the century before last. Burns has the money to buy anything except the one thing his condition has taken from him permanently. Company. Real company. The kind that comes from people who know you across time rather than people who know you as you currently are. Smithers schedules the treatments, but nobody talks to Burns about what it was like when the world was different. Nobody can. He outlived everyone who could. The Skinner episode's most important contribution to the show's mythology isn't the specific revelation about Skinner's identity, it's the mechanism it makes visible, the social machinery of Springfield's denial. And that machinery, once you understand how it works, is visible everywhere in the show's history. Consider the monorail. Springfield was sold a monorail by a con artist in what is widely considered one of the greatest Simpsons episodes ever produced. The monorail failed catastrophically on its inaugural run. Homer saved the day through a specific piece of improvised engineering, but the monorail itself was a disaster. The town was defrauded. The infrastructure was built on a lie. Real money was spent. Real danger was created. And then the monorail is never mentioned again, not referenced, not pointed at as a reason for skepticism about future civic projects. Not brought up when new opportunities to spend community resources on grandiose schemes are presented. The monorail happened and then it didn't happen, in the specific way that Springfield makes things happen and then not happen. The town elected Mayor Quimby many times despite abundant evidence that he is corrupt in virtually every way a local politician can be corrupt. Not re-elected him without noticing the corruption. Re-elected him knowing about the corruption because the corruption is a settled fact of Springfield's political environment that everyone has agreed to accommodate rather than address. The collective has decided that Mayor Quimby's corruption is part of the landscape, like the tire fire, and that acknowledging it as a problem requiring action would produce more disruption than simply continuing to work around it. The tire fire. There is a tire fire in Springfield. It has been burning for some period of years. Nobody has put it out. It is simply a feature of the landscape. Environmental regulations presumably govern tire fires in the real world. Someone in Springfield's government is presumably aware that a permanent tire fire represents an ongoing environmental and public health issue. But the tire fire is there, it's burning, and it has been incorporated into the collective understanding of what Springfield is, rather than treated as a solvable problem requiring a solution. This is the Skinner mechanism operating at a lower intensity than the episode depicts it. Not a formal vote, not a legal decree, just the gradual accretion of collective tolerance until something that should be alarming becomes background noise. The tire fire, the three-eyed fish, the safety violations at the plant, the safety inspector who sleeps at his workstation. Each of these things was, at some point, presumably noticed by at least some people in Springfield as something that shouldn't be normal, and the collective machinery processed it and normalized it and added it to the settled landscape of what Springfield is. The formal vote in the Skinner episode is the exception, not the rule. Most of Springfield's collective forgetting doesn't require a vote because the social pressure to not notice and not pursue doesn't need explicit democratic ratification to function. It operates through the accumulated weight of mutual understanding. Everyone knows you don't pursue certain questions. Everyone knows the questions that go nowhere are the questions about the plant and the fish and the water and the billionaire who owns all of it. The knowledge of which questions to not ask is transmitted implicitly through social cues and professional relationships and the economic realities of living in a town where Burns's continued goodwill is the difference between the community functioning and the community collapsing. Nobody had to teach Springfield residents not to ask about the three-eyed fish. The social environment did it for them. Maggie's silence has a quality that becomes clearer the more attention you pay to its consistency. It's not the silence of disengagement. She's not absent from the conversations happening around her. She's not tuned out or distracted. She is present, specifically and deliberately present, in a way that is different from how the other family members occupy shared space. Homer's presence in a room tends to be loud and physical and demanding. He takes up space. He generates noise. He pulls the room's attention toward himself. Marge's presence is organizing, concerned, practically focused on the needs of everyone around her. Bart's presence is provocative, seeking reaction, designed to produce responses he can then respond to. Lisa's presence is intellectual, processing, analyzing, often visible in her expression as she engages with whatever she's thinking about. Maggie's presence is receptive. She takes everything in and gives back nothing that can be easily interpreted. She watches, she listens, she processes, and she produces periodically actions that reveal how much she has absorbed without showing her work. This is the most sophisticated form of social intelligence possible. To appear absent while being comprehensively present. To seem passive while actively accumulating information. To let people around you believe you're not engaged while engaging more thoroughly than anyone who announces their engagement can do. Adults do this sometimes, in professional contexts or in social situations where gathering information is more valuable than demonstrating that you're gathering it. It's considered a sophisticated strategic behavior when adults do it consciously. Maggie appears to be doing it instinctively, or by deliberate choice that is indistinguishable from instinct, because she started doing it so early that it's now simply how she moves through the world. What she's been gathering across 36 years is interesting to contemplate. She has a comprehensive record of every significant family conversation she's been present for. She knows the family's arguments, their resolutions, their patterns of behavior under stress and under comfort. She knows Homer's specific vulnerabilities and how they interact with his specific strengths. She knows Marge's coping mechanisms and where their limits are. She knows how Bart and Lisa relate to each other. The complicated sibling dynamic of a brilliant idealist and a brilliant provocateur sharing a household that doesn't quite know what to do with either of them. She knows Springfield, not in the limited way that any one adult knows the town, filtered through one specific professional and social context. She has observed Springfield from the unique position of someone who moves through it while being largely invisible, who can watch adult interactions without the adults modifying those interactions to account for being watched by someone with full cognitive comprehension. People edit themselves around other people they believe are fully cognitively present. They don't edit themselves the same way around someone they believe is a baby who doesn't understand what's happening. Maggie has spent 36 years in the room where conversations are unedited, where people say things they wouldn't say if they knew the baby in the corner understood every word. She has heard things. She has seen things. She has accumulated a picture of Springfield and its systems and its people that no one else possesses because no one else was ever in the position she was in. Cognitive comprehension paired with social invisibility. What she does with that picture is the question the show has been holding open for 3.5 decades. Mona Simpson's story raises a question about inheritance that the show gestures at without fully developing. What does it mean to inherit the consequences of a parent's choices, specifically choices made before you were old enough to have any say in them? Homer inherited everything. The wound of her absence, the lie Abe told to cover that absence, The shape of his personality formed around a hole that he didn't know was a hole for the first 30 years of his life. The deal his father made with Burns that guaranteed his employment and that he never knew about. The emotional patterns of a man raised by a single parent who was himself damaged and distant and ill-equipped to provide the kind of nurturing that might have compensated for Mona's absence. And then Homer's children inherited from Homer, not the specific wound but its downstream effects. A father whose emotional needs are enormous, and whose capacity to meet other people's emotional needs is limited by the same wound. A father who loves his children desperately, in the way people love things they're afraid of losing, which is to say, sometimes too tightly and sometimes not quite in the forms the children need. A father who chose stupidity in one of the show's most heartbreaking moments, because intelligence in Springfield was too painful to sustain. Bart's rebellion is Homer's unfocused energy given a direction. Lisa's intensity is Homer's desperate desire to be significant given the cognitive tools he never had. Maggie's silence is something Mona might recognize, if she were still alive to see it. The posture of someone who has learned that the world is complicated and dangerous, and that the wisest response is to watch and wait rather than announce yourself. Burns didn't just damage Homer, he planted something in the Simpson family line. Not a biological thing, not a mutation in the radiation sense, a pattern, a way of being in the world that is shaped around the specific harm Burns did in 1969. And that pattern propagates. Homer carries it. His children carry different versions of it. If they have children, those children will carry something too. This is how institutional damage works in the real world. It doesn't stay contained to the individual who first experienced it. It shapes how that individual raises the next generation, and how the next generation, shaped by that shaping, raises the one after. Burns did something to one family in 1969, and the effects are still visible 3 generations later, in the specific forms of damage and strength and coping and avoidance that the Simpson family displays. Springfield is full of families like this, families shaped by what the plant and its owner have done over decades, not in ways they can trace directly, but in the patterns of behavior and belief and limitation that pass from generation to generation without anyone quite understanding where they came from or why they're there. This is the radiation theory's deepest implication, not the physical mutations, the social mutations. The ways that an institution exercising total economic and environmental control over a community shapes not just the bodies of the people within it, but the emotional and social patterns that those people transmit to their children. Burns built something that lasted, not just the plant, the dependency, the damage, the pattern of limitation and acceptance, and carefully not looking at the source of your own suffering because looking at it would require you to do something about it. He built that, and it has been running, self-sustaining, for longer than the show has existed. The prediction phenomenon has a dimension that usually goes unexamined in discussions of it, which is the specific mechanics of how The Simpsons has shaped cultural expectations about the future. The show has been on the air long enough to have raised several generations of viewers. People who watched it as children in the early 1990s are now adults in their 40s. People who grew up with it as adolescents in the late 1990s and early 2000s are now in their 30s. A significant portion of the currently active professional class in America grew up with The Simpsons as a primary cultural reference point. This includes people in politics, people in technology, people in media, people in finance, people in academia, people in regulatory agencies, people in the industries that the show has satirized across its run. When these people were young, they absorbed The Simpsons' satirical observations about American institutions, about the relationship between corporate power and democratic governance, about the ways that money shapes political outcomes, about the ways that environmental and public health concerns get subordinated to economic interests, about the ways that celebrity culture and political culture are not as separate as they're supposed to be. They absorbed these observations as comedy, as satire, as the show's characteristic way of pointing at the world and finding it funny. But comedy, absorbed over years and decades, doesn't stay separate from the worldview it shapes. The satirical observations become part of how you understand the world. They become expectations. They become the frame through which you interpret events as they develop. And people who make decisions, professional decisions, creative decisions, political decisions, about how the future should be shaped, carry those absorbed frameworks with them into those decisions. Not consciously, not as direct imitation of what the show depicted, but as a residue of expectation about what the world is capable of and what directions it tends to move. The show predicted Trump's presidency in one reading. In another reading, the show contributed to the cultural environment that made Trump's presidency possible by familiarizing a generation with the idea that celebrity and political power are compatible categories. By making that compatibility feel like a logical endpoint rather than an aberration, by presenting it as satire that was also, unmistakably, observation. Satire and observation. The show has always done both simultaneously, and when the observations are absorbed as satire, they enter the culture in a form that normalizes rather than challenges. We laugh at the idea of a celebrity president. We share the screenshot of the Simpsons prediction. We feel clever for having the reference. And in the background, the idea has been absorbed and processed and filed in the category of things that could happen, things that have been imagined, things that feel familiar because a cartoon we love made them feel familiar first. The predictions aren't prophecy, they're influence. The show told you what was coming, and then the world came. Springfield's geographic ambiguity has one more dimension worth exploring, which is what it reveals about the show's relationship to American identity more broadly. Every specific location carries specific associations. If Springfield is in Oregon, it's a Pacific Northwest town with the specific cultural and environmental characteristics of that region. If it's in Kentucky, it's a southern town with different characteristics. If it's in Ohio, it's a Midwest town. Each state, each region, brings with it a set of cultural resonances that would immediately narrow the kinds of stories the show can tell and the kinds of Americans who feel the show is about them. By making Springfield unlocatable, the show makes it applicable. Any American viewer from any part of the country can locate their own experience within Springfield's geography because Springfield's geography contains all of American geography simultaneously. The mountains are wherever your mountains are. The desert is wherever your desert is. The ocean is wherever your ocean is. Springfield is the American landscape reassembled from memory and longing, all of it layered together in one impossible place. This is what America is, at the level of cultural mythology. Not a specific place, an idea of a place that contains all the specific places within it. The frontier and the city and the farmland and the suburb and the coast and the interior, all of it American, all of it part of the same thing. The Simpsons' Springfield is the cartographic expression of that myth. And like most American myths, it's impossible to locate precisely because it's everywhere. You can't point to it on a map because it doesn't exist at any specific point. It exists everywhere that any American recognizes something familiar in it. Which is everywhere. Which is the whole country. Springfield doesn't have a state because Springfield is every state. And the fact that you can't find it on a map doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It means it exists in the only place that matters for what it is, in the imagination, in the cultural memory, in the space between what America is and what America has always been telling itself it is. Hans Moleman has spoken, over the course of his many appearances, a surprising amount. For a character whose primary narrative function is to suffer and die and return and suffer again, he has been given dialogue that, accumulated across episodes, paints a picture of a life that is genuinely moving in its specificity. He was married once. The marriage ended. He attributes his drinking to the marriage ending, and he describes his drinking in ways that suggest it went on long enough to contribute to the physical condition we see when we look at him. He drives poorly, he says, because of his eyesight, and his eyesight is described as failing in ways consistent with the kind of progressive deterioration that various radiation-related conditions can produce. He has had jobs, he has held positions, he has, somewhere in the deep background of Springfield's history, been a person with a life organized around things other than public catastrophe. The catastrophe is what we see. The life underneath it is present in the margins, in the occasional line that grounds his suffering in something more than slapstick. He is 31 years old and he looks like the end of something. Whatever happened to Hans Moleman happened comprehensively. It happened to his health and his vision and his face and his relationship to the world. It happened in a place where things like this happen, where the water carries things it shouldn't, and the air is not quite what it should be, and a man can age 50 years in 20, and nobody at his doctor's office apparently finds this remarkable enough to mention. He comes back from death. Over and over. He returns. And every time he returns, he is still 31 years old, and still the same level of destroyed, and still finding himself in situations that are about to become unfortunate for him. Maybe that's the most Springfield thing about Molman. Not that he dies so often, that he comes back every time. To the same town, to the same life, to the same ongoing relationship with a community that barely notices him, and yet he keeps returning to it. He doesn't leave Springfield. He keeps showing up, as if whatever Springfield is, whatever the town represents, is the place he belongs even when it keeps killing him. He comes back because the town is his. Whatever it's done to him, wherever it's put him, however many times its infrastructure has sent him to the hospital or the grave, Springfield is where he lives. That's very human. More human than almost anything else in the show. The way a person keeps returning to the place that's harming them because it's still the place that's theirs. The way a community, even a contaminated and broken and institutionally corrupt community, remains home to the people who grew up in it. Mole Man keeps coming back. That might be enough. There's a version of the floating timeline argument that nobody wants to make explicitly because it says something uncomfortable about the relationship between the audience and the show. The Simpsons has been on the air for 36 years. A significant portion of the people watching it now first watched it as children. Some of them have children of their own now who are watching it for the first time. The show has been present across life stages, across decades, across the fundamental transitions of human experience, in ways that virtually no other piece of media has managed at the same scale for the same duration. This means the show has been there for a lot. It was there when people were young and nothing was particularly serious. It was there when things started to get more serious, and the comedy of Springfield's impossible situations felt like it was commenting on real situations that were getting harder to navigate. It was there during losses, during political events that felt like they changed everything, during personal upheavals, during the slow accumulation of age, and it stayed the same throughout all of that. Bart stayed 10, Lisa stayed 8, Homer came home from the plant every evening and the couch was there and the family was there and the loop ran. There is something that the loop's persistence has given the people who grew up with it. A fixed point. Something that doesn't change when everything else does. The world outside Springfield keeps moving, keeps generating new situations and new challenges and new forms of loss and new configurations of difficulty. Springfield stays. The Simpsons stay. The couch stays. This is not a small thing. Psychologically, the ability to return to something familiar and unchanged is meaningful. It's why people rewatch old television, old movies, old things that feel like home. Not because the new things aren't good, because the familiar things don't demand the same work of accommodation. They're already integrated. You don't have to figure out how they fit, they already fit. The Simpsons is the most extreme version of this available in television history. 36 years of something that doesn't change. That's longer than most relationships, longer than most careers, longer than most people have lived anywhere. The show has been there, consistent, available, the same family in the same house with the same problems, resolving in the same, essentially forgiving way, for longer than most of the people watching it can remember. The floating timeline isn't just a narrative device. It's the mechanism by which the show provides this. By not aging the characters, by not allowing Springfield to evolve in ways that would make it unrecognizable, by keeping the loop running in the same basic configuration it's always run, the show preserves its function as the fixed point. If Bart turned 18 and went to college, the loop would break. The fixed point would shift. Springfield would become a different place with different configurations, and the return to it would require a different kind of work. It would no longer be home in the same way. It would be a place that had changed while you were living your life, the way real places do. The way things outside of fiction change and require you to accommodate the change. Springfield doesn't change. And that's the gift. And the reason you can close your eyes tonight and the show will still be there when you wake up. Bart will still be 10. Lisa will still be playing her saxophone. Homer will still be driving home from the plant in whatever car he's using this episode. Marge will still be there. The loop runs. It will keep running. And as long as it runs, the family is intact and the house is warm and you can come back to it whenever you need to. That's the whole point. That's always been the whole point. Close your eyes. Springfield will be here when you wake up. Springfield is populated by one of the largest, most detailed, and most consistently rendered ensemble casts in the history of American television. The main family gets the most attention, as they should. But the background of Springfield is crowded with recurring characters whose stories, examined carefully, reveal the same patterns we've been tracing all night. Contamination, institutional failure, Collective denial. The specific costs of living in a community that has surrendered its self-determination to a single economic entity. Let's spend some time in the background. Chief Clancy Wiggum. Wiggum is Springfield's chief of police. He is, by essentially any professional standard, extraordinarily bad at his job. Not just limited or undertrained or underfunded, though all of those things are also true. He is actively bad at the core functions of law enforcement. He cannot solve crimes. He does not solve crimes. The Springfield Police Department under his leadership has never, in the entire run of the show, demonstrated the kind of investigative competence that would be required to actually protect the community from criminal activity. This has been treated consistently as a source of comedy. Wiggum is a buffoon. His son Ralph is slightly detached from the conventions of reality in ways the show plays as endearing. The department as a whole is a joke institution doing just enough to maintain the appearance of a functioning police force while producing nothing in the way of genuine public safety outcomes. But step outside the comedy register for a moment and consider what it means for a community to have no functioning law enforcement. Not imperfect law enforcement, not law enforcement with limited resources struggling against impossible demands. A law enforcement apparatus that is structurally incapable of producing the outcomes that law enforcement is supposed to produce. Burns has committed crimes in Springfield. Many crimes. Environmental crimes of enormous scale. Financial crimes. What might be characterized as crimes against public health. He has used his wealth and his institutional connections to operate outside the normal framework of legal accountability. And the law enforcement institution that theoretically exists to enforce accountability in Springfield cannot do so, will not do so, has demonstrated across decades of operation that it is not going to do so. This is not an accident. Small-town police departments in communities dominated by a single employer exist in a structural relationship with that employer that limits their independence in various ways. The employer's taxes fund the municipal budget that funds the police department. The employer's goodwill affects the economic conditions that affect the police officers' families. The employer's connections reach into political relationships that determine appointments and funding levels. None of this requires explicit corruption, though explicit corruption is certainly possible. It just requires the accumulation of dependencies that make genuine institutional independence functionally impossible. Wiggum's incompetence is the outcome of this structure, not the cause of it. The cause is that Springfield's law enforcement exists in a community where the entity most requiring law enforcement oversight is also the entity that determines the conditions under which law enforcement operates. Wiggum can't pursue Burns, because pursuing Burns would destabilize the entire institutional environment that makes Wiggum's existence as a police chief possible. And so Wiggum solves the crimes that can be solved without touching anything important. He arrests shoplifters. He responds to domestic disturbances. He chases cats out of trees with an endearing lack of success. He does the visible work of law enforcement while the invisible work, the work that would require challenging the power structure of the town, goes perpetually undone. This is Wiggum's tragedy, buried under the comedy of his incompetence. He is not stupid in the way that makes him incapable of seeing what's around him. He is constrained in ways that produce the same outcomes as stupidity, but that originate in the structural dependencies of the community rather than in his individual limitations. Or maybe he's just not that bright. Springfield is full of people who aren't that bright, and the radiation theory offers a mechanism for that too. Apu nahasape mapetilon. Apu runs the Quick E-Mart. He has been running the Quick E-Mart for the entire run of the show. He knows every regular customer by name and by their typical purchase patterns. He works extraordinarily long hours. He is one of the most hardworking and reliable presences in Springfield's commercial landscape. And he sells, among other things, expired food. Not occasionally. Regularly. The Quick E-Mart has been depicted multiple times selling products past their expiration dates, food of questionable provenance, items stored under conditions that would raise flags with any health inspector paying attention. The Quick E-Mart's product quality is, to put it charitably, variable in ways that a more strictly regulated commercial environment would not permit. Springfield's regulatory environment is not strict. We've established this comprehensively through the power plant story. But the Quick E-Mart's specific relationship to product quality raises an interesting secondary question. In a community already being contaminated by its power plant, does it matter that the convenience store also sells food whose safety is occasionally in question? Maybe not in isolation, but accumulated with everything else that Springfield's residents are absorbing, everything they're drinking and breathing and eating without full information about its safety, the Quickie Mart represents another node in the network of low-level exposure that the radiation theory predicts would compound over time. Apu himself is an interesting case under the radiation framework. He has 8 children, octuplets, which are rare enough in normal populations to be considered extraordinary. He conceived and raised these children in Springfield, in the same contaminated environment as everyone else. 8 children simultaneously suggests either extraordinary luck or biological processes that have been altered by the environment in ways that affect reproductive outcomes. Radiation exposure affects reproductive biology in documented ways in the real world. The effects are complex and variable, but the idea that Springfield's contamination might have observable effects on reproductive outcomes in its population is consistent with the radiation theory's broader framework. Apu's 8 children are played for comedy. They're a background gag about the challenges of large families. But they're also, under the lens we've been applying tonight, a data point. Moe's Shislak. Moe's Tavern is Springfield's most important social institution outside of the nuclear plant itself. It is the place where Springfield's adult male population processes the experiences of their daily lives, where Homer and his friends gather, where problems are discussed without being solved, where the specific combination of alcohol and companionship produces the social bonding that holds the community's adult relationships together. Moe himself is one of the show's most emotionally complex characters, buried under a presentation that foregrounds his various neuroses and failures. He is deeply lonely. The show has been honest about this across many episodes. He has never had a sustained romantic relationship. His social world is essentially limited to the tavern and its regular customers. His emotional life is characterized by a yearning for connection that he consistently undermines through behavior that drives connection away. And he was a boxer. Once, before the tavern, before Springfield, he had a life with different parameters, different aspirations, different measurements of what success looked like. The tavern is not what Moe planned. The loneliness is not what Moe planned. Springfield is, for Moe, the place where a different life ended and this life began. And he has been behind that bar ever since, serving the same drinks to the same regulars, watching the same people navigate versions of the same problems, night after night after night. The tavern has been threatened with closure multiple times. Burns financially ruined it at one point. Regulatory actions have threatened it. The building itself has been destroyed on at least one occasion. And every time, the tavern comes back. Because Moe's Tavern is a load-bearing institution of Springfield's social structure, remove it and the social network that holds the town's adult male community together loses its primary node. The community feels this even if it can't articulate it. The tavern survives because the town needs it to survive. But at what cost to Moe? To serve that function, to be the place where Springfield processes itself, requires Moe to be there. Every night, every regular visit from Homer and his friends, every time the door opens and someone needs somewhere to be. Moe is there. He is always there. He cannot not be there because the tavern is what he is now. If Springfield has done something to its residents in the way the radiation theory suggests, Moe's case might illustrate a different aspect of that something. Not cognitive impairment, not physical mutation, a kind of emotional narrowing. A person whose world has compressed until it fits inside a bar, whose social universe has contracted until it consists of the same handful of people having the same handful of conversations. Is that a personality? Is it a choice? Or is it the outcome of spending decades in a community that doesn't support its members' aspirations beyond the specific economic and social roles they were assigned early in their adult lives? Springfield doesn't have a lot of upward mobility in evidence. Characters tend to be what they are, doing what they do, in the positions they occupy when we meet them. The social order is remarkably stable. Not in the way that stable, healthy communities are stable, where stability reflects general satisfaction with the existing arrangement. In the way that stuck communities are stable, where stability reflects the absence of the conditions that would allow movement. Burns controls too much. The economy is too dependent on one source. The regulatory environment is too compromised to create the conditions for genuine competition. The cognitive effects of the contamination have been operating too long. The collective denial is too comprehensive. Springfield is stuck. And the secondary characters, the Moes and the Wiggums and the Apis and the Hans Molmans, are the proof of it. They are what people become when the conditions for change are systematically absent. They are Springfield's accumulated human cost. Still breathing easy? Good. Let the room stay soft. We're almost done. The show has been running this portrait for 36 years. Not as a political argument, not as a manifesto, as a comedy about a family and a town that keeps finding itself in impossible situations and keeps finding its way back to the couch by the end of the episode. The comedy doesn't undermine the portrait. The comedy is how the portrait survives. If The Simpsons tried to say all of this directly, if it tried to make the argument plainly, it would be a different kind of show, and it would reach a different kind of audience, and it would probably have been canceled after 3 seasons. Instead, it makes the argument through jokes, through the accumulation of comic details that, piled high enough and held in place long enough, become a body of evidence that no single joke contains, but that the whole archive makes undeniable. That's the show's real achievement. Not the predictions, not the longevity, not the records. The achievement is that it made you laugh at Springfield for 36 years and slipped the argument inside the laughter without you quite noticing. Until a night like this one, when you stop and look at what you've been seeing all along. The yellow skin, the 4 fingers, the cracked cooling towers, the billionaire who glows in the dark, the safety inspector who sleeps at his station, the baby with the gun, the town that voted to make truth illegal, the mother who disappeared, the father who never understood why his life felt so heavy. You've been looking at all of it for years. You just hadn't stopped to put it together. Now you have. Now you can let it rest. Close your eyes. The couch is there. The family is there. The loop is running. Springfield is exactly where we left it. We've been in Springfield for a long time tonight. Let's take one more slow walk before we're done. The thing about The Simpsons is that none of the theories we've spent tonight exploring actually diminish it. The radiation theory doesn't make the show grim. The coma theory doesn't make it sad, at least not in a way that cancels out the warmth. The collective denial theory doesn't make Springfield feel hopeless. The immortality of Burns doesn't make the show feel cruel. The mysteries around the shooting, around Maggie, around Mona Simpson, and what was done to the family across 3 generations, none of these things make you love the show less. They make you love it differently. Because what all of the theories, taken together, are really pointing at is the specificity of the love underneath the comedy. The Simpsons is not a show that loves its characters abstractly, the way that shows which like their characters but don't quite know them do. It loves them specifically. It knows Homer's specific weakness, the desperate need to be remembered, to not be forgotten, to have his name known by the man who signs his checks. It knows Lisa's specific loneliness, the loneliness of being the most capable person in a room that has decided capability is not what it's looking for. It knows Bart's specific bravery, the way he puts his full self into things that mostly don't work out, with the specific courage of someone who has decided that the trying is worth more than the outcome. And Marge. The show knows Marge in a way that is underappreciated. Marge is the person who holds the structure together, not by being passive or long-suffering in a defeated way, but by making active choices, over and over, to maintain the family's cohesion against the forces that would erode it. She chooses Homer repeatedly, not because she has no alternatives, but because she has assessed what Homer is and decided that the sum of him is worth the cost of the specific ways he's difficult. She chooses her children, in the specific ways that each of them needs to be chosen. She chooses Springfield, this impossible, contaminated, locked-in-time community, as the place where her life is worth building. Marge's choice is the show's most radical element, buried under the comedy of her exasperated tolerance. She looks at all of it clearly, clearer than Homer can with his radiation fog and his crayon, clearer than Burns looking down from his sealed-off life, and she chooses to stay and make it worth something. That's the show, under all the theories. Under the contamination and the coma and the political corruption and the collective amnesia and the shooting that was never quite solved and the town that can't be found on any map, a woman chooses her family, over and over, with full knowledge of what she's choosing. And the family, held together by that choice, manages to be worth it. That's why the loop runs. That's why we keep coming back. Not for the mysteries, not for the theories, not for the satisfaction of an analysis that makes all the pieces fit. For Marge at the kitchen window, watching Homer come up the driveway. For Lisa in her room, playing the same notes over and over until they sound like something that wasn't there before. For Bart on the skateboard about to do something that is probably going to be fine, probably. For Maggie in the corner, watching all of it with those enormous eyes and knowing more than she'll ever say. For Homer coming home, that's Springfield. That's the whole thing. 36 years of a man coming home to his family in an impossible town that shouldn't exist and does anyway. Because we need it to. Because they need it to. Because home is what you make it and what you protect and what you return to. Over and over. Even when returning is hard, and the town has cracked cooling towers, and the water has three-eyed fish in it, and the truth has been made illegal by a judge's decree, and everything is a little bit wrong in ways that nobody can quite articulate, you come home anyway. That's what Homer does. Every episode. That's the loop. That's the point. Come home. Close your eyes. Rest. Springfield will be there in the morning, exactly where you left it, exactly as it always was. And that's enough. That's always been enough. Before we finally let Springfield rest for the night, there is one more thing worth saying about why this show works the way it works, why it has held its audience through every shift and change and critique and cultural evolution across 3.5 decades. Broken places are real. Most places are broken in some way. Every community has its version of the contamination story, the economic dependency that shapes too many decisions, the institutional failure that gets normalized over enough time, the collective agreement to look away from the thing that would be too costly to look directly at. Every family has its version of the Mona Simpson absence, the wound that shapes everyone around it without anyone quite understanding where the shape came from. Every town has its version of Ned Flanders next door, the person who does everything right and gets nothing guaranteed from the doing, living in close proximity to the Homer, who does everything wrong and gets away with it all the same. The Simpsons doesn't invent these patterns. It recognizes them. It finds them and names them in the specific language of comedy, because comedy is the language that allows recognition without requiring the audience to immediately do something about what they've recognized. You can laugh at Springfield and feel the recognition land and let it sit in you without it becoming an unbearable demand that you fix it right now. That's what good satire does. It doesn't shame you into action. It creates the space for seeing clearly, and it does this by making the seeing feel warm rather than cold. You see yourself in Homer's fog and you laugh rather than despair. You see your community in Springfield's collective denial, and you recognize the pattern rather than being crushed by it. The recognition is the gift, not the solution. The show doesn't offer solutions. It offers sustained, affectionate, gently devastating recognition. And it offers, underneath everything else, the image of a family that stays together through all of it. That keeps choosing each other. That comes home every evening to the same couch in the same house in the same impossible town. That image, repeated across nearly 800 episodes across 36 years, is the argument the show is making. Not about politics or economics or radiation or comas or collective denial. About the specific, limited, enormously important thing that family does. It stays. It forgives. It comes home. Even in a broken place. Especially in a broken place. That's Springfield. That's the whole point. That's why we keep watching. Now close your eyes and let it all go. The theories will be here when you come back. Springfield will be here. The family will be on the couch. Everything is exactly as it should be. Sleep well.